Let's say I had an apple and you had an orange, and I wanted an orange and you wanted an apple. We could trade, and both of us would end up happier than when we started. But now let's say I had an apple tree and you had an orange tree, and the apples from the apple tree were ready, but the oranges wouldn't ripen for another month. I could give you an apple now, and you could promise to give me an orange in a month when they're ready, and both of us would end up happier than when we started. Although, maybe you didn't want an apple. Maybe you wanted a pear, but all I had to give was my apple, and I still wanted your orange. Well, maybe there was a third guy, a pear-laden guy, and he wanted an apple. So I give him my apple, he gives you his pear, and you promise to give me your orange in a month, and we all end up happier than when we started. But then maybe we start to trade bigger quantities, and maybe we add more people with different fruits on different harvest schedules, and maybe we decide that certain popular fruits are worth more, and 2 of one equals 1 of the other, and 1 of the other equals 3 of the third, and it all starts to get just a little bit complicated. So we simplify. Instead of trading physical fruit for physical fruit, we trade physical fruit for fruit credits, clay balls with a generic fruit symbol carved into them. If I trade an apple into the system, I get a credit, and when I want that orange, I trade the credit in. Nobody has to keep track of what I'm owed. Now that we have this system going, we might as well add vegetables into the mix. Sure, it's not fruit, but we want veggies sometimes, and the veggie farmers want fruit too, so the system still works. Naturally, as the system develops and develops with more and more items and more complexity, we start to feel that these fruit credits have value, even though they merely represent theoretical value. But that theoretical value can be turned into real value, and so in a way, the clay balls, the representation of theoretical value that translates into real value, hold real value in and of themselves. So, someone starts a business where they'll keep your fruit credits safe for you, free of charge. Better yet, they'll pay you to keep your credits safe. It sounds like a scam, and maybe it is, but you take the risk and deposit 1,000 credits. Elsewhere, in order to grow more watermelons this year, and therefore earn more fruit credits, a watermelon farmer needs more credits than she has to exchange for an irrigation system. So, this new credit storage business offers to give her 7,500 credits if she promises to give 9,000 back in a year. This seems like a safe bet since she's already a successful watermelon farmer, and it's worth it for her since she'll get the new irrigation system, and worth it to this new fruit credit safeguarding business since they'll get more credits, and everyone ends up happier than when they started. Meanwhile, you're told that you can take your credits out at any time, and you can, even if they only kept 250 of them on hand. That's because there are 9 more farmers that deposited their 1,000 credits too, and even if the safeguarding business only kept a quarter of them, a quarter of all deposits is much more than your 1,000, and the chances of everyone wanting their credits at the same time is negligibly low. So, this is a free money machine. You make money, the bank makes money, and the watermelon farmer makes money. Everyone makes money. But wait, everyone makes money? You, the bank, and the watermelon farmer end up with more money than when you started, so where did it come from? If we turn this into a closed loop, where no money enters or exits the system, we can track down the source. So 10 people with 10,000 credits each deposit 1,000, meaning the bank now has 10,000. The bank lends those 7,500 out to the watermelon farmer, meaning it now holds 2,500. She pays that 7,500 to one of the 10 depositors for an irrigation system they're selling. One growing season later, the farmer has 9,000 watermelons that she brings to the market and sells 900 of them to each of the same group of 10 that put their money into the bank. They now each have 9,100 credits, 1,000 of which sit in the bank. Meanwhile, the farmer has 9,000 which she gives to the bank, meaning it now holds 11,500 credits. So the farmer has nothing, the 10 individuals have 98,500 total, and the bank has 11,500, meaning there are now 110,000 credits in the system. Once again, money has appeared out of thin air. So, its source. In the very first step, 10,000 credit deposits go into the bank, but the 10 individuals still each have $10,000. It's just that 1,000 of it's in the bank. That's not the bank's money, so the 10,000 sitting in their vault isn't theirs, which means the money is created exactly now. The moment that loan goes out, new money has appeared. The original depositors still have their 100,000 credits because with the way the fractional reserve banking system works, they can all, on an individual level, withdraw their 10,000. But simultaneously, the watermelon farmer has 7,500 very real credits. If you have a roommate that you agree to share your blender with, only one blender physically exists. but 2 blenders worth of value is being extracted from it because you're both using it just as much as you'd use your own dedicated blender. That's essentially what's happening with money, except that with money, we track the per person value rather than the per blender value. Now, it'd be easy to argue that we can't consider the bank to have created 10,000 credits, and that's fair because the system wouldn't work if it lent 10,000 because it couldn't give the original depositors their money back. But it does work when they give away 7,500. A 25% reserve ratio is very typical in a fractional reserve banking system, so we can at least say 7,500 was created. You could still argue that the 7,500 isn't actually money since it's eventually owed back to the depositors, except that, if you trust and engage in the global financial system, that's not what you believe. When you receive a loan, you can take out that money in cash, and when you deposit money in a bank account, you can take out that money in cash. It is very real money representing very real value. This is exactly why answering the question of how much money exists is so tough. There are at least 6 different commonly accepted definitions incorporating different combinations of currency, demand deposits, traveler's checks, time deposits, and more. And this means of money creation is one of the primary activities that central banks like the Federal Reserve, Bank of England, or Bank of Japan seek to administer and regulate. They're in charge of telling banks how much money they have to keep in reserves, which throttles how much money appears out of thin air through banks' lending process. Of course, the aspect to take note of is the fact that money is created when it moves. Money is never created while it's sitting still. So back in 1867, when moving money was tough and banks were rudimentary, physical currency still pretty well correlated to the total supply of money. Most dollars were represented by a physical bill or coin. But since then, well, things have changed. Abstraction helps money move. Adding paper stand-ins for precious rare minerals speeds up the transportation of funds and transactions. Abstraction helps money grow, too, as a bank's ability to loan money provides its customers the assets to then create value. Abstraction, however, doesn't alone move money from one bank to the next, one town to the next, one state to the next, or one country to the next like it does today. That required standardization. Before the Civil War, there were thousands of different types of paper money backed by all sorts of private and public institutions in the US. Say, for example, a watchmaker from Waltham, Massachusetts in 1857 went into their bank to withdraw this $20 bill to buy some machinery down in Brookline. This isn't the $20 bill anyone today is used to. This is a Waltham Bank $20 bill, redeemable in gold at only the Waltham Bank, but of uncertain value to anyone outside of the Waltham Bank. Now, while the watchmaker's not taking on the risk or inconvenience of carrying 20 Waltham dollars worth of gold, there's also no guarantee that the merchant in Brookline will take the note from a bank so far out of their way. Perhaps because of the distance, they'll tack on a fee for the inconvenience of cashing the note and say the machinery is now 23 Waltham dollars. Or perhaps the watchmaker gets lucky and they are only one of many business relations the Brookline merchant keeps in the Waltham area, then maybe the merchant will accept the Waltham dollars knowing they'll be able to use the bill in the future. Regardless of the fate of the Waltham watchmaker, what their predicament underscores is that money, when in many different forms from many different places, was hard to move, hard to transact with, and hard to transfer outside of one's immediate community. All this changed with the National Currency Acts of the 1860s. Out went thousands of separately backed private banknotes, in came nationally chartered banks, and so began a new era of money moving with a new means with which to do it: the modern check. Under the new rules, all nationally chartered banks had to carry about 25% of their liabilities in reserve. In other words, of all the money they were good for, a quarter of that needed to be held in gold in the basement. Crucially though, these smaller banks, or country banks, could hold these reserves in the central reserve cities, or the few big banks. Effectively, the two banks were now connected. Someone could now take a check from their local bank, head into the city and buy supplies, and that check could then be settled at the larger correspondent bank without any gold having to move outside the vault. And not only were these two banks connected, countless small banks were now all linked together through that correspondent bank functioning as a hub. This simple connection had major consequences. It allowed a customer to move money regionally without the hassle of navigating a maze of domestic exchange rates, thus stimulating growth, and without the slow and risky necessity of moving actual coins or cash from bank to bank, making the process quicker. In this environment, armed with a Waltham check rather than Waltham dollars, a watchmaker could pay for their supplies, the merchant could deposit their check at the Brookline Bank, and the Brookline Bank, in turn, assuming because of their proximity they share a correspondent bank, would send the check to the correspondent, which then would balance each bank's funds by moving money across the basement. Now, this process at the time was far from efficient, especially when banks didn't share immediate correspondent banks. When a check moved money between banks without a direct link, they had to find a third-party bank, or in some cases multiple banks, to bridge the gap and connect them with a correspondent, racking up fees, delays, and postage all along the way. Take, for example, this check from 1898 for $43.56, which was deposited at the Second National Bank of Hoboken, New Jersey, before Second National then sent it to Harvey Fisk & Sons, who sent it to the Globe National Bank of Boston, who sent it to the First National Bank of Tonawanda, who sent it to the National Exchange Bank of Albany, who then sent it to a bank in Port Jefferson, who then sent it here, 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 where it was finally drawn. Still, while inefficient, these early checks were a critical stepping stone in standardizing and moving an increasingly abstract form of money. Bank account totals denoted in dollars, not gold. The use of checks and the ease of their accounting took a major step forward with the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, which split the nation into 12 separate regions and tasked each regional Federal Reserve Bank with filling the role of clearinghouse for all regional checks. This centralization streamlined processing, as a bank could now credit a merchant's account and know exactly which Federal Reserve Bank to send it to. It also codified a critically important function that would allow money to move farther and become increasingly abstract in the decades to come: rigorous accounting. In the early 1900s, checks were still rather rare, and their use remained mostly regional. Then came the 50s. Now, Americans were making more money than ever, spending more money than ever, and had more bank accounts than ever. From 1943 to 1952, national check use doubled from 4 to 8 billion a year, and through multi-step proofing and processing, American banks were wading through some 69 million checks every day. Banks were drowning under the pressure. Branches closed at 2 in the afternoon to shift all work to matching signatures, running the adding machine, double-checking the math, and packaging the checks for shipping to the Federal Reserve. The work was grueling. Most clerical staff at banks quit within a year, but it was absolutely necessary. With more money passing through their hands than ever before, they had to be as accurate as humanly possible. Relief, though, came in the form of a computer the size of a room designed by the Stanford Research Institute, funded by the Bank of America, and built by IBM. They called it the Electronic Recording Machine Accounting, or IRMA, and it transformed banking. Before IRMA, checks were processed at every bank branch, they came in all sizes, and they weren't identified by bank account numbers. To move the process of sorting checks to the computer, they need to be the same size and they'd need numbers rather than names to be organized by. Once those standards were adopted, checks were entered into the computer, which read the magnetic ink, and if the account belonged to a Bank of America branch, IRMA would access the account stored in its 16 by 20 inch magnetic drum memory, check for any account holds, make sure the balance in the account was positive, draw the amount, tally the total, save the new balance, and print the new record. Where human eyes misread and human hands mistyped, IRMA didn't, as the computer even went so far as to check the routing number by plugging the digits into this algorithm to ensure the check's legitimacy. Now, the paper processing crisis that began in the 1950s was not solely a Bank of America problem, it was structural. From monthly insurance bills to tax returns to social security checks, no matter how many sorting machines were added to the system, if every transaction took the form of a flimsy paper check that needed to physically pass from person to bank to Fed to bank, then the paper avalanche simply couldn't be contained. So payment systems went electronic, and the automated clearinghouse network revolutionized the domestic movement of money when adopted in the 1970s. Where thousands of checks once poured into reserve banks and private clearinghouses every day, the ACH network now allowed for direct deposits, automatic payments, and ATM transactions. Now someone looking to pay their insurance premium could hand over their bank account information to the insurance company, the company's bank would then create an ACH entry requesting to withdraw money, the request would be processed by the ACH's operator, and the money would be debited from one account and credited to the other, no check required. Of course, security and the ability to uphold accurate accounting were of paramount concern in an era before the internet. Companies adopted microdeposits as a means to verify bank accounts, Federal Reserve officials helped form a regulatory body called NACHA, and in 1978, Congress passed the Electronic Fund Transfer Act to limit customer liability and protect them against wrong or fraudulent charges. The measures successfully erased consumer fears. Today, the ACH network moves over $50 trillion across 23 billion transfers a year. While ACH securely moves mountains of money stateside, its role ends where the US does. For international transfers, there's the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications, or SWIFT, which, like ACH, was established in the 70s to streamline payments, but at the international scale. SWIFT doesn't actually move money, but instead provides its 11,000 member banks a secure network and a standardized messaging format to send payment orders. Prior to SWIFT, international transfers lacked standardization, security, and accuracy. So SWIFT started from scratch, organizing its member banks in a manner similar to the routing numbers on a check, assigning each an 8 to 11 character code that denotes bank name, country, location, and branch. The program also standardized how payments were communicated. They start with a bank code, but the payment instructions are outlined in an MT-103 document, which, as they're processed, can be tracked by the bank and, once the transaction is complete, will function as a receipt. Now, if someone's wiring money from the US through, say, Bank of America to Germany through Deutsche Bank, rather than actually sending money, the MT-103 will tell Deutsche Bank how many dollars to pull from Bank of America's Nostra account held at Deutsche Bank and convert them to euros to be deposited into the recipient's account. Like correspondent banks settling checks in the early 1900s without taking the risk of shipping gold coins in the mail, SWIFT members are able to fulfill international transactions without actually moving money across oceans. Through its simplicity relative to programs before it, once a SWIFT transfer is initiated and then communicated through SwiftNet's encrypted message system, a transfer is usually completed within 24 to 48 hours, with more complicated multi-bank transactions accounting for some transfers taking longer. Still, even though SWIFT functions as a member-owned cooperative and therefore doesn't maximize profit, it's neither cheap nor easy to manage a global network capable of securely passing along more than 40 million messages a day. This cost is felt by member banks who pay to enter SWIFT, then pay SWIFT by the message. Costs that add up, and costs that trickle down, too. Today, each international transfer, be it part of everyday business or someone sending money to their family back home, usually gets tagged with a fee likely starting in the $40 range. Considering the cost and complexity of transferring money, some have identified the opportunity of layering a simpler system on top of it. Wise, for example, is one of the world's hottest fintech startups focusing primarily on remittances. There are loads of low to medium income people working outside of their home country who pay those huge fees to send money to their families back home, but Wise designed a system that almost entirely circumvents those intermediaries. Essentially, if someone in the US is sending $1,000 to someone in Australia, they actually transfer money into Wise's American account, then the company instructs its Australian account to send the equivalent amount, minus fees, to the recipient. They're essentially a private market equivalent of SWIFT. It's a dead simple system that leads to the same end result, but with far less cost and complexity. Banks can't do this. You see, if Wise messes up and sends the recipient money without debiting the sender, the company is out $1,000. If a bank messes up and gives the recipient $1,000 without the sender being debited, $1,000 just appears out of nowhere. So that can't happen. It just simply can't. Then the company instructs its Australian account to send the equivalent amount, minus a member account without actually moving money across oceans. Through its simplicity relative to programs before it, once a SWIFT transfer is initiated and then communicated through SwiftNet's encrypted message system, a transfer is usually completed within 24 to 48 hours, with more complicated multi-bank transactions accounting for some transfers taking longer. Still, even though SWIFT functions as a member-owned cooperative and therefore doesn't maximize profit, it's neither cheap nor easy to manage a global network capable of securely passing along more than 40 million messages a day. This cost is felt by member banks who pay to enter SWIFT, then pay SWIFT by the message. Costs that add up, and costs that trickle down, too. Today, each international transfer, be it part of everyday business or someone sending money to their family back home, usually gets tagged with a fee likely starting in the $40 range. Considering the cost and complexity of transferring money, some have identified the opportunity of layering a simpler system on top of it. Wise, for example, is one of the world's hottest fintech startups focusing primarily on remittances. There are loads of low to medium income people working outside of their home country who pay those huge fees to send money to their families back home, but Wise designed a system that almost entirely circumvents those intermediaries. Essentially, if someone in the US is sending $1,000 to someone in Australia, they actually transfer money into Wise's American account, then the company instructs its Australian account to send the equivalent amount, minus fees, to the recipient. They're essentially a private market equivalent of SWIFT. It's a dead simple system that leads to the same end result, low to medium income people working outside of their home country who pay those huge fees to send money to their families back home, but Wise designed a system that almost entirely circumvents those intermediaries. Essentially, if someone in the US is sending $1,000 to someone in Australia, They actually transfer money into Wise's American account, then the company instructs its Australian account to send the equivalent amount, minus fees, to the recipient. They're essentially a private market equivalent of SWIFT. It's a dead simple system that leads to the same end result, but with far less cost and complexity. Banks can't do this. You see, if Wise messes up and sends the recipient money without debiting the sender, the company is out $1,000. If a bank messes up and gives the recipient $1,000 without the sender being debited, $1,000 just appears out of nowhere. So that can't happen. It just simply can't. If it does, money breaks, our trust breaks, the system breaks. If money erroneously appears outside of the context in which we allow it to appear, then it's not functioning like its physical counterpart would. Money really is just a means of accounting. It's accounting for the fact that you owe me an orange. But if you give me the orange and I don't give you the fruit credit, then the system didn't work. The accounting failed. For the modern digital financial system to function at all, the process of transfer has to be as infallible as the process of handing a clay ball from one person to the next. Simulating physicality in a digital network as vast and distributed as the global financial system is incredibly complex, considering how complex the system itself is. These expensive, burdensome middlemen are the institutions that protect that simulated physicality, so without them, money is worthless. Alternatives are arising, most notably the blockchain, and central banks like the Federal Reserve are studying whether to introduce blockchain-based digital currencies, but for now, the world still runs on money, and money's value is all in the system's ability to account for it. Few things in the digital world are as finite as money, with one notable exception: domains. There is only one wendoverproductions.com, for example. That scarcity means domains have real value, and they especially have real value to you if you start a business or a YouTube channel or something where having the corresponding domain name matters. Hover can help with that. They're the domain marketplace that I've used to buy all of my domains because they have fair and transparent pricing, a super quick purchasing process, and absolutely excellent customer support. Quite literally the moment we landed on Jetlag the Game as the name for our new channel, for example, I went on Hover and bought jetlagthegame.com. And if the .com domain you want is already taken, Hover can still help because they offer over 400 unique domain extensions, allowing you to create combinations like our wendover.productions domain. And to top it all off, you can set up an email using your new domain in less than a minute, allowing you to drop the @Gmail or @iCloud bit for something of your own. All in all, Hover is just simply the best place to buy domains online, and it's made even better by the fact that clicking the button on screen or heading to hover.com/wendover will get you 10% off your first purchase and help support the channel while you're at it.
This episode is a more detailed follow-up to my 2017 video, Who Controls All of Our Money? I'm going to focus on the United States in this video.
You are watching Cold Fusion TV.
With a little bit of a simple kind of drama, rhyme the fire and blind eyes open when the rhyme's smoking from the writing. Gentle giant shining armor on the track, soft fact that relation, then we put it on wax like that.
Welcome to another Cold Fusion video. I'm going to start this video off with a quote. Henry Ford once said, "It is well enough that the people of the nation do not understand our banking and monetary system, for if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning." I quote this because it encapsulates the fact that the contents of this video may be unsettling compared to the videos that I normally make. I still feel compelled to make this video because I've been exploring the financial world for the last 4 years, and it's definitely given me a more complete view of the world. I want to share some of what I've come across with you guys. I'm also going to do a video about cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin in the future, and to understand why Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies may continue to rise, it's critical that you understand the contents of this video. I hope that you find this topic interesting and that it inspires you to do your own research afterwards. Now, with that said, let's begin. So who controls all of our money? It's a simple question. We all know that you and I don't control it. Our employees don't control it. The companies that they work for don't control it. So who does? Where does it even come from in the first place? I'll give you a hint. Money does not come from the government. It's a seemingly obvious question that's never asked or taught in schools for some reason. Unfortunately, most people's lives are basically dedicated to money. It's all people ever worry about or talk about. We go to school to learn basically how to go to university, to learn the skills to get a good job, so that we can trade hours of our lives, all for this thing called money. So why wouldn't you want to know where money comes from and who issues it? Today, in this very special video, you're about to find out the answer to the question of who controls all of our money. People today can tell something isn't quite right with our financial system, but they just can't put their finger on it. Some people think it's the failure of government, others think that it's the failure of capitalism itself. This video should clarify a few things. The year is 1694, and England had just suffered through 50 years of war. Exhausted, the English government needed loans to fund their political means. Brainchild of Scottish banker William Paterson, it was decided that a privately owned bank that could issue the money to the government out of thin air was to be the solution. This was the very first modern central banking system in the world. Central banking is more influential than laws, governments, and politicians, but strangely not the focus of the general public. Fast forward to the early 20th century, and after 2 failed attempts, a group of bankers wanted to put a central bank in the United States of America. It was December of 1910, and Senator Nelson Aldrich boarded a private train car in New York with 6 others. The 6 were not to be spotted by any news reporters to avoid questions. Their destination? Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. The meeting went for 9 days, and from that, they created the Federal Reserve System. This is all documented and a matter of public record. Some of them went on to write about the meetings in their personal biographies. Here's a quote from Frank Vanderlip, president of the National City Bank of New York, February 9th, 1935, in the Saturday Evening Post.
I was as secretive, indeed as furtive as any conspirator. Discovery, we knew, simply must not happen, or else all our time and effort would be wasted. If it were to be exposed that our particular group had got together and written a banking bill, that bill would have no chance whatever of passage by Congress.
The 6 men that Nelson Aldrich brought together included the head of banks, branches of government such as the Treasury, and some of the richest people on earth at the time. To give you an idea of how rich they were, in 1910, these 6 men represented a quarter of the world's worth. The bankers told the American public that the purpose of the system was to stabilize the economy and to stop the grip of the Wall Street banks over America. The problem was, the guys that wrote the bill were the very same people they said they'd stop. If they succeeded, it will give a small group of men the ability to create money from nothing and loan it to the American government with interest. So why was it done in secret? Because the American people didn't want a central bank. Back then, unlike today, people knew what central banks were and understood them very well. Everywhere a central bank went, there'll be wealth inequality, wild swings between economic booms and busts, and after each bust, those at the top of society mysteriously came out richer while everyone else got poorer. Europe was the running example of this at the time. The Federal Reserve was originally drafted as the Aldrich Bill, but when it came into Congress, they recognized Senator Aldrich's name and smelt a rat. The bankers needed better cover. They decided to send 2 millionaire friends to carry the bill to quell the suspicions of Congress and renamed it the Federal Reserve Act. Next, in a textbook lesson of deceit, the bankers set out to fool the American people through disinformation. In the newspapers of the day, the bankers screamed and protested against the new Federal Reserve Bill. It would ruin the banks, they exclaimed. The average person read the protesting articles of the bankers and thought to themselves, if the bankers hate it, it must be good. And then they ended up unknowingly supporting a Trojan horse. The bankers also fooled Congress by putting clauses in the bill that limited their power only to remove them once the bill was passed. A double head fake of the public and Congress was all it took. The bill was passed on December 23, 1913, while most of Congress was out on holiday. And with that, a small group had complete monopoly over the issuing and creation of American money. Today, the Federal Reserve is the most powerful entity in the United States, and they're not ashamed to admit it either. Here's former Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan.
What should be the proper relationship between a chairman of the Fed and a president of the United States?
Well, first of all, the Federal Reserve is an independent agency, and that means basically that there is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take. What the relationships are don't frankly matter.
In addition to this, it seems that the Fed can't even be touched by investigating parties.
So I'm asking you if your agency has, in fact, according to Bloomberg, extended $9 trillion in credit, which, by the way, works out to $30,000 for every single man, woman, and child in this country. I'd like to know, if you're not responsible for investigating that, who is?
We have responsibility for the Federal Reserve's programs and operations, audits, to conduct audits and investigations in that area. In terms of who's responsible for investigating, would you mind repeating the question one more time?
Mr. Chairman, my time is up, but I have to tell you honestly, I am shocked to find out that nobody at the Federal Reserve, including the Inspector General, is keeping track of this.
So what does all of this have to do with me, you might be asking? I don't even live in the US. Well, 2 reasons. Number 1, the central banking model from the Bank of England and the United States has now been put in all countries, and even consolidated power in parts of Europe as the European Central Bank, or ECB. This unites separate countries under one economic policy. The only places in the world that don't have central banks are North Korea, Iran, and Cuba. In 2000, this list suspiciously included Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya. And number 2, since the end of World War II, the US dollar has been the reserve currency of the world. This means that all central banks hold US dollars in their reserves. In other words, all other currencies are backed by the US dollar. This directly links your country to the Federal Reserve's monetary policy in America. More on this later. When the post-World War II monetary system, called the Bretton Woods system, was created, all US dollars were backed by and exchangeable for gold. A byproduct of this was that currencies used to be very stable in relation to each other.
Before that, all the countries, the exchange rates were fixed, and year after year you could predict what prices were going to be. You could start a business elsewhere, know if you could calculate profits. Business was much easier before floating exchange rates.
Unfortunately, in 1971, due to a falling US dollar, international capital flows into gold, and the funding of the Vietnam War, President Nixon took the US dollar off the gold standard.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets.
Now the dollar was floating and backed by nothing, and has been ever since. Okay, so let's think a little. If the US dollar is backed by nothing, but the world's reserves are backed by the US dollar, intrinsically, since 1971, doesn't this mean that all currencies are now backed by nothing tangible, only trust in the American government? Well, this is correct. Money backed by nothing is known as fiat currency. Fiat in Latin means let it be done. In other words, the government says it is money, so it is. A consequence to having money backed by nothing is that whenever the Federal Reserve creates money, it dilutes the currency supply of all other nations because their reserves are backed by the US dollar. All countries' reserves are worth less each time money is created. In the past few years, the Federal Reserve has printed trillions of dollars, and countries like Russia and China have noticed this. As a reaction to the money printing, these countries have been selling US dollar reserves and buying gold over the same period. But wait a second. Some of you clever thinkers out there may have asked yourself, if every currency on Earth is backed by nothing, how am I able to pay for things? Well, as it turns out, the whole economic system today is running because it's backed by faith. Faith that you can exchange your unit of currency for goods or services. In a way, part of that faith comes from the fact that not many people actually know where money comes from. We're about to find that out in this video. A central bank is essentially the entity that manages a nation's money supply, and it can loan money to the government with interest. In the United States and most other countries, it works like this. When the government needs more money than they receive from taxes, they ask the Treasury Department for money. The The Treasury then receives an IOU or bond from the government. The Treasury, through the banks, gives this IOU to the Federal Reserve. The Fed then writes a check for this IOU and hands it to the banks. At this exchange at the banks, money is created and it can be used to pay government bills. So hang on, where does the Fed get the money to be able to write this check? They get this money from nowhere. They literally just invent it. Here's a quote from the Boston Federal Reserve. Quote, "When you or I write a check, there must be sufficient funds in our account to cover the check. But when the Federal Reserve writes a check, there is no bank deposit on which that check is drawn. When the Federal Reserve writes a check, it is creating money." End quote. So in essence, they're writing a check and creating money from an account that has no money in it. The money the Federal Reserve creates can be used as legal tender to buy things and eventually makes its way into the real economy. If you and I did that, we'd go to jail for fraud, but they can do it because they invented the system. This is the same system used throughout the world today. Another part of this money creation happens at the commercial bank side. Every time you take out a loan to buy a house, car, or TV, banks create money out of nowhere to give you this loan, and you still have to pay interest on it. And don't just believe me when I say that. Hear it for yourself from the horse's mouth, the people running the system. Graham Towers, former governor of the Central Bank of Canada, states, quote, "Each and every time a bank makes a loan, new credit is created, new deposits, brand new money." End quote. Paul Tucker, Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, quote, "Banks extend credit by simply increasing the borrowing customer's current account." End quote. So what they're basically saying is that each time the bank makes a loan, the bank doesn't use other people's deposited money and give it to you. It creates new money. In modern times, this means typing digits into a computer. 97% of all money is digitally created like this. Only 3% is the physical cash and coins that we carry. Another crazy thing that commercial banks can do is lend out 10 times more money than they actually have in reserves. This is called fractional reserve lending. So who wrote this ridiculous system into law? For the United States, it was part of the Federal Reserve System drafted in 1913. And again, this is the same system used throughout the world. So what's the issue? Why should I even care? Well, there's consequences. When more loans are given out, more money is created, and the rest of the money in circulation is worth less and less as the years go on. This is known as inflation. In a way, inflation is basically a tax that we all pay for the fraud of money printing. Easy money now in exchange for tax on our future generations. It's also why in 1950, a house used to cost $7,000 and a car, $2,000. Obviously, this is no longer the same today. Things will always keep getting more expensive as long as this system is in place. This was actually kind of okay because wages grew in relation to inflation until about 2008. Why this stopped happening is a story for another day. So things are already pretty crazy, but they get even crazier. The more you look into it, the stranger things become. So remember how we're talking about how central banks and commercial banks can create money out of nothing? This procedure actually does create something. It creates debt. Let me explain. When you take out a loan, it's written down as an asset in the bank as a negative form, kind of like a negative value of money, or otherwise known as debt. Under this system, debt is actually money. And again, don't just listen to me. Mariner Eccles, former governor of the Federal Reserve, states, quote, "If there were no debts in our money system, there wouldn't be any money." So in essence, instead of gold being the backbone of our economy, it's now debt. The system we're under now is sometimes referred to as the debt-based monetary system. It requires that debt always grows. Countries and people must become deeper in debt so that there's more money in the system, because remember, debt is money. If people and governments stop borrowing money and pay back loans, the debt doesn't grow, the money supply shrinks, and the system falters. It truly is bizarre, but we all live in this system each and every day. The Federal Reserve and other central banks control money by adjusting its supply and how much it costs to borrow money, otherwise known as the interest rate. With these tools, and as a consequence of human group psychology, central banks can create booms and busts in the economy at will and also distort and derail an economy by messing with it. Let's take a quick case study. In the year 2000, Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan cut interest rates to 1%. He did this to try and fight off a recession from the dot-com bubble and encourage people to borrow money. When interest rates are low, if you're borrowing money, you save a whole lot on repaying mortgages. Since a 1% interest rate hadn't been seen at the time since the 1950s, it was a pretty good deal. Greenspan's idea was that he could create a wealth effect. People would start to buy houses, the prices would go up, and then people would feel wealthier and spend more money in the economy and stimulate it. Greenspan sure succeeded in getting people to borrow money to buy houses, but they borrowed too much, and the result was the 2008 housing bubble. This is a prime example of what can go wrong when central banks mess with an economy. Yes, corrupt bankers have a lot to answer for in their role in the 2008 crisis, but the Fed has a far bigger long-term impact. Even crazier things are happening in Japan. Their central bank is buying so many stocks that they were the #1 buyer of Japanese stocks in 2016. So they have part ownership of companies with money that they created from nothing. So in essence, it is the central banks that control our economy and the central and commercial banking system together that control all of our money. The difference is, central banks can create money at will, while commercial banks need loans to create money. To give you an idea of people's views of central banking when people actually knew what central banks were, here's a couple of examples. In 1881, then President of the United States, James Garfield, states, quote, "Whoever controls the volume of money in any country is absolute master of all industry and commerce, and when you realize that the entire system is very easily controlled one way or another by a few powerful men at the top, you will not have to be told how periods of inflation and depression originate." End quote. Benjamin Franklin in his autobiography stated that the prime reason for the American War of Independence was a battle over who actually controlled and issued the money of the new colonies. Moving on to more modern times, Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman states, quote, "The Federal Reserve definitely caused the Great Depression by contracting the amount of currency in circulation by 1/3 from 1929 to 1933, end quote. So with all of this being said, some would argue that central banks are not inherently a bad thing. They just need to be part of the government and not privately owned. The government should be able to issue its own money for the benefit of the people and shouldn't have to pay a massive interest on its own debt. This was tried at least once in the United States by President Lincoln, who stated this,
"The government should create, issue, and circulate all the currency and credit needed to satisfy the spending power of the government and the buying power of consumers. By the adoption of these principles, the taxpayers will be saved immense sums of interest. Money will cease to be master and become the servant of humanity."
Abraham Lincoln then issued his own government money. It was called the greenback. No further comments on that story. So I think we'll end the video there. There's so much more that I could cover about what central banking decisions led to what revolutions around the world. Pretty much when you look at it, all revolutions and all wars, when you dig through everything, it all boils down to money. I could also have talked about the new global movement of those who are rejecting the debt-based economic system. People are starting to move their currency into gold, silver, and cryptocurrencies, like Bitcoin. So there is a light at the end of the tunnel, but that's a whole nother story for another day. Anyways, if you've watched the whole way through this video, congratulations. You're one of the few who have found out the hidden truths about who controls all of our money. I think I've only met about 4 people in real life that have been aware of the debt-based economic system. It's strangely unknown, but is as true as anything. I even showed you all of the quotes of the bankers and the former heads of the Federal Reserve telling you from their own mouths how the system actually works. If this is your first time of hearing all of this, I encourage you, as I said before, to do your own research, and then you'll start to see the bigger picture, and the world today will make a whole lot more sense. If you want some good starting resources, I recommend Mike Maloney's Hidden Secrets of Money series. It's here on YouTube and I'll leave a link below. Mike is a very knowledgeable guy and I've had some great long conversations with him about the economy. If you are into reading and you want to know more about the history of the Federal Reserve, I recommend the book by G. Edward Griffin, The Creature from Jekyll Island. So anyway, I think I'll stop talking now. Thanks for watching this video. This has been Dagogo. You've been watching Cold Fusion. Feel free to subscribe to this channel if you're new. This isn't the stuff I normally make, but I think you'll like the other stuff anyway. I really hope you learned something from this video, and I'll see you again soon for the next video. Cheers guys, have a good one.
cold fusion. It's new thinking.
This video is brought to you by Discord. This episode is a more detailed follow-up to my 2017 video, Who Controls All of Our Money? I'm going to focus on the United States in this video only because they're the world reserve currency. But everything in this video affects all of us because the central banks around the world are all doing the same thing. With that being said, let's begin. Around the world today, we see central banks printing money. So here's a question. We're told from a young age that money is hard to come by. We should study to work our whole life to earn it. How then can all this money suddenly come from nowhere? How is money created? Who's going to pay it back? What exactly does all of this mean? And what's going to happen next? In this episode, we'll explore the 3 ways that money is being created and some of the consequences that are going to happen. I'm also going to show you the true origins of wealth inequality. If you watch this episode the whole way through, you should have a well-rounded idea of what's going on today. It's important for people to know. I'm really just trying to help with that. This journey starts off simple enough, but by the end, you'll start to see the insanity of what we're dealing with.
You are watching Cold Fusion TV.
The first form of money is the one created by government. In practice, it's outsourced to the central bank Royal Mint, but controlled by the government. Physical money comes in 2 forms, either paper money or coins. This physical money is a tiny fraction of the economy, and in many economies, this kind of money only makes up about 3 to 8%. This physical money is created in order to meet the obligations of private banks. When you go to an ATM and try to withdraw cash, banks need to make sure that they have enough cash in order to meet those obligations. So let's take a $10 note for example. It costs approximately 3 cents in order to print this note. This means that there's approximately $9.97 of profit for creating a $10 note. This $9.97 can now be added to tax revenue of the government. This revenue is called seigniorage. So since the government makes profit from printing and minting coins and can reduce the amount of taxation on the public, you might be thinking, why don't governments just always print physical money? The main reason that governments don't create the majority of money is because of politicians. If the politician running the office could create money at will, there would be a massive conflict of interest. There would be an urge to keep printing to fulfill campaign promises or fund wars. This would, in theory, destroy the currency by excessive printing, causing massive devaluation. The more money you have in circulation, the less it's worth. And that's a key point. For example, if massive inflation takes place and the average Joe has $1 million, but that $1 million only buys an apple, how much is $1 million actually worth? The loss in purchasing power of money over time is called inflation, and when inflation gets out of hand, money becomes worthless. Some recent examples of runaway inflation include Argentina, Zimbabwe, and Venezuela. In this animation, you can graphically see just how fast inflation can run away. You don't see it coming, and as the inflation rate goes up, people quickly lose faith in the currency. For example, here we can see some people in Venezuela using money to make handbags and to draw pictures on because it simply isn't worth anything anymore. You can think of money as a measuring stick of value, a measuring stick that is highly elastic and can change depending on how much of it there is. For thousands of years, gold was the measuring stick of value. Gold was kind of like a physical anchor, keeping the money supply in check and governments responsible. In 1971, President Richard Nixon announced that the United States would no longer convert dollars to gold at a fixed value. Since that point, money, the measuring stick of value, has become elastic. Since the US dollar backs all other currencies as a reserve currency, Nixon's decision changed the world. In all of this, you might still notice that despite politicians supposedly not being able to influence money creation, it's happening anyway. This may cause problems, as we'll see later in the episode. So to recap, the government creates physical forms of money, like notes and coins. Only about 3 to 8% of money is made this way. Signage is the income from that physical money. This income is both a benefit to the government and the taxpayer. It reduces debt for the government and reduces the burden on the individual taxpayer. The reason governments don't create more of this money is because of the inflation risk from politicians' decisions. Let's move on to number 2, private banks and debt-based money. The vast amount of money created today is done by the private banking sector. In most developed economies, about 97% of the entire money supply is created digitally by banks, and therefore most money in the world is privatized. Banks invented digital money when they managed to persuade lawmakers after many early bank runs. A bank run is an event where depositors try to get their money out all at once, but the banks don't have it. From these events, banks argued that they should be legally allowed to create more deposits than actually exist based upon debt. And this is how governments outsourced the creation of digital money. The idea of using debt as money begins much earlier than this. English innovators set the stage for banks to become the creators of money across the globe. In 1704, the English Parliament passed the Promissory Notes Act. Take a good look at your screen. What you are seeing is a promissory note. In this case, it's a written promise to say that you'll pay back the $20 you borrowed. Under the law, this piece of paper was as good as $20. Today, we digitize this agreement and call it debt. If it helps, whenever I say debt in this episode, you can think of this piece of paper, remembering that it's as good as money. Okay, so banks were authorized to be able to use these debt notes to circulate as money. From this point, banks were free to create and destroy debt, and hence money from themselves rented out at interest. In the modern world, as you'll see, the whole world's economy is based upon these promises. Let's take a look at how it works today. When you go to a bank to borrow some money, the banking license gives that bank the ability to create money every time they issue a loan. They do this through the double accounting system. For example, if you buy a $500,000 house, the bank creates $500,000 in their account and you have $500,000 in debt. That is, the promise to pay it back with interest. This $500,000 debt can enter the wider economic system because when you purchase the house, the owner of that house can use that fresh debt that was created by the bank that they received from you to buy other things in the economy. This means in our current system, if we want to have more growth, we need more debt. The key point here is that debt is actually money, just from a different point of view. To the lender, it's an asset of money, and to the borrower, it's a liability of debt. But they are one and the same. It sounds a bit complicated, but all you need to know is that when a bank issues a loan, it's not somebody else's savings. It's not money that the bank had. It's essentially brand new money that they create. They simply type it into a computer and it appears as a digital representation of the government's money which you can spend. The beneficiary of this brand new money is actually the bank because they get to charge interest on that money, and that's how they make a profit. Later, when you repay this loan, the debt disappears and the money also disappears, but the bank's profit from the interest remains. The real estate and property markets are the largest tools for creating digital money. This is because banks have decided that it's the safest yet most profitable form of creating debt. Because if you can't repay the loan, the banks can simply take your house. In developed nations, vast amounts of money is backed by the mortgage market. In Australia, where I live, it's become particularly bad. For decades now, the banks have abandoned investment into the wider economy and have shifted their focus to investments in housing. This has pushed up the housing prices as people take on more debts to buy houses that they otherwise couldn't afford, but the banks make more money. This cycle over many decades has caused one of the biggest property bubbles on the planet.
We're addicted to debt.
Yes, we're addicted to debt as individuals, as households. The ratios are way higher than almost every other country.
So that's loans. But what about deposits? When you deposit cash into a bank, you are no longer the legal owner of that money. The banks are. They keep 10% of your deposits on reserve and can loan out 90% of that money to someone else. And that other person can deposit that money into another bank, and then that bank can loan out 90%, and so on. This is known as fractional reserve lending.
If they say, we'll transfer it to your account, that's wrong, because no money is transferred at all. Because what we call a deposit is simply the bank's record of its debt to the public. Now, it also owes you money, and its record of the money it owes you is what you think you're getting as money, and that's all it is.
When all is said and done, an initial deposit of $100 with a 10% reserve requirement can ultimately lead to $1,000 in total money circulation. Well, at least that was how it used to work. Until March the 26th, 2020, there is now a 0% reserve requirement. According to the Federal Reserve, quote, "This action eliminated reserve requirements for all depository institutions," end quote. So, banks can now create infinite amounts of money with no reserves. And it doesn't stop there. When banks hold your deposit, they can, along with hedge funds, gamble with it through investment in financial instruments such as derivatives and securities. They do this in order to make superior returns. Most of the time, these instruments are basically just bets on if the price of an asset will rise or fall. But when taken to the extreme, it can get ridiculous. Remember in my Enron video how I talked about how they use financial instruments to bet on the weather? These crazy classes of financial instruments is what brought down the housing market and the subsequent global economy in 2008. But the problem today is that banks are playing with so many derivatives, sometimes stacked on top of each other, with leverage multiplying factors, that nobody actually knows how much money is tied up in this gambling. Some estimates put the derivative market at over $1 quadrillion, over 10 times the global economy. In booms, everyone takes on debt, that is, loans from a bank, and they spend it on things that they normally couldn't afford, but this causes economic growth. Eventually, people can't afford to take on more debt and can't pay it back. The banks stop lending and defaults start to take place, and the economy takes a downturn. This is natural and has happened over centuries. But in 2008, everything changed. The world didn't want to go through the pain of a downturn, and some analysts mark this as the very point that the real economy died. In 2008, banks had become so large, intertwined, and integral to the supply of money that when they were about to collapse, the governments had to use the central banks to bail them out. Remember, banks are creating 97% of all money as debt, and if this can't be paid back, it can cause a systemic failure, a risk of collapse of the entire global monetary system. Since 2008, the economy was dead, but has been on life support ever since. A decade of hyper-low interest rates, which basically make the cost of borrowing money free, have caused market distortions so large that it's compounded the entire problem. It was short-term gains for the consequence of long-term pain. When private banks make risky bets and incur losses, central banks can rescue them with their infinite wallet, as mentioned by Fed Chairman Jerome Powell in a recent interview for CNBC's 60 Minutes.
Fair to say you simply flooded the system with money?
Yes, we did. That's another way to think about it. We did.
Where does it come from? Do you just print it?
We print it digitally. So we as a central bank, we have the ability to create money digitally, and we do that by buying treasury bills or bonds or other government guaranteed securities, and that actually increases the money supply.
But by law, Chairman Powell's Federal Reserve can only lend money that must be paid back.
We'll get to central banks in the next section. But as you'll soon see, we have to pay these debts back. All of this money that's being created is like that piece of paper we saw with the promise on it. Except it's signed by all of us, and we signed that we're going to pay this back through taxation. Us and our future generations. It's important to note that governments don't actually support the people. It's the people that support governments through taxation. Taxation and trade are the two major ways that governments can raise money. This raised money is used to pay back the central bank loans with interest. So when governments use the central banks to bail out private banks for their risky behavior, the governments are left with the debt which eventually has to be paid back by the taxpayers in the future. So to recap, private banks create the vast majority of money, about 97% of it, and they do so by creating loans, which is debt. The process is as simple as typing numbers into a computer. Banks can, to an extent, spend and gamble consumer deposits as they legally own it. Too big to fail banks are backed up by the central bank, creating a moral hazard. And that brings us to the final and most insane form of money creation: central bank digital money. The third form of money is quantitative easing, or QE. Quantitative easing is a new form of money that was invented by the Japanese central bank in 1989. It was later popularized by the Federal Reserve in the United States during the 2008 crisis. QE is where a central bank creates money in order to issue loans directly to the banking sector, large corporations, and most recently, the public. It's a way of flooding money into the economy at times of extreme events like the financial crisis of 2008. As a result of this, the central bank's balance sheets have gone completely out of control in order to prop up the economy a little bit longer. In 2008, during the crisis, and the first time this was tried outside of Japan, the $700 billion bailout of QE was very controversial.
Bailing out Wall Street is the only way to save Main Street, so says the president.
The house of cards was much bigger. Started to stretch beyond just Wall Street.
That's how the president defended one of the largest proposed financial rescue plans in U.S. history. Treasury Department and congressional staffers are working through the weekend, hammering out the details. The president's plan would allow the Treasury to buy up to $700 billion worth of bad loans, like many of those subprime mortgage deals. But those bad debts then go on the American public's tab. Congress will have to raise the legal limit on the national debt from $10.6 trillion to $11.3 trillion.
It was thought to be a one-off emergency scenario, but over the next decade, the Federal Reserve was unable to reverse it. To give you an idea of how significant all of this was, it took from the foundation of America in 1776 all the way up to 2008 for the nation to attain less than $1 trillion in debt. By 2014, that number had expanded to $4.4 trillion. And since the onset of the COVID pandemic, $3 trillion was added in the span of 3 months. Now, the US central bank is creating hundreds of billions of dollars in mere hours. It's seeming to have less of an effect as it continues.
We have a lot of good faith based on the prowess of the U.S. printing press. I mean, the United States maintains reserve currency status.
That's fake money, though. That's not real money. That's fake money. That's $200 trillion of fake money.
Oh, you're really? I know, but it's all based on faith.
How long is this sustainable, though, to go at that pace? The argument then becomes about the taxpayer who's pissed off and saying, let me get this straight. You can constantly bail yourself out, and you can constantly go print money with this quantitative easing. Why the hell do I have to pay taxes? Why do I pay taxes?
These are the seeds of social unrest in this country. You can only drive so big of a wedge between the haves and the have-nots, especially when you're gutting out the middle class in the process. The Federal Reserve monetizing the U.S. debt is what enables all of this.
So how does this money enter the system? Central banks use their magic money to buy the equivalent amount of bonds from the government. They do this through the bond market, which exists to lend money to corporations or governments. Although the stock market gets more press, the bond market is actually bigger. So what is a bond? For the purposes of this video, it's basically the same as debt but is issued by a government or corporation. Central banks, which have no savings, can create money to buy these bonds. So here's an important question. Can a central bank go bankrupt? Well, according to the European Central Bank, which published a paper in 2016, central banks are protected from insolvency due to their ability to create more money. If you think this sounds a bit unfair, just wait. Governments in our current situation are stuck between a rock and a hard place. They can't raise money except for raising taxes, but owe trillions to central banks. The hope is that the borrowed money can kickstart the economy, but something else is happening. When central banks buy bonds given by the government or corporations, they can end up owning a lot of the world's assets. For example, the balance sheet of the Japanese central bank is bigger than the entire GDP of Japan. They own 80% of their stock market. That's right, the Central Bank of Japan is their stock market's largest shareholder. The Swiss central bank owns $90 billion in American stocks, including Apple, Microsoft, Google, and Amazon. When I first heard of this a few years ago, I simply couldn't believe it was legal. So, these central banks are creating money out of nothing, and they can't go bankrupt, but yet, they're buying real assets. Even a toddler can see that something is wrong here. It turns out that creating money out of nothing and buying things does have some consequences. These sorts of central bank interventions remove stock markets from reality. Throughout the 20th century, the stock market actually used to reflect the economy, but recently, that's gone completely out of whack. The US stock market has become almost twice as big as the entire nation's GDP, which literally makes no sense. Central bank intervention is the main reason why in April 2020, 30 million people became unemployed in the United States, but the stock market had its best month since 1987. The central bank printed trillions, gave it to banks and hedge funds, with almost 0% interest rates. This money made it straight into the stock market, while the real economy barely got any help. Earlier, we discussed that money printing leads to inflation. So why haven't we seen it yet? Well, we have. We've seen inflation globally in housing prices and stock markets. The printed money ends up in all of these assets pushing up the prices, so the few people who own large amounts of stocks end up ridiculously wealthy while there's no growth in the real economy. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. A lot of people can feel and see the wealth inequality, but they have no idea where it's coming from. I'm going to show you in 3 charts. Since the 1980s, the wealth of the upper echelons of society has been tied to the stock market. Since 2008, when the economy went on life support, the stock market became glued to the Federal Reserve. The more they print, the more the stock market goes up, and the richer they become. Since 1980, their wealth has grown 420%. When central banks print money, the first recipients of that newly printed money enjoy higher standards of living at the expense of the later recipients of that money when inflation has already taken hold. This phenomena is known as the Cantillon effect. Experts believe that when the rich finally start selling their stocks and real estate so as to buy other assets in times of distress, the money velocity, that is, the rate at which money changes hands in the economy, will start to pick up. And that is when we'll start seeing real inflation in the general economy. There is so much more to this, but I'll leave it here for today. So to recap, central banks have no savings in their account. They can't go bankrupt, but can create infinite amounts of money by buying government bonds. A bond is an exchange of money for a promise that the government would eventually pay it back with interest. This money eventually must be paid back by future citizens of a country, either through taxation or inflation. So what do we do? It's clear that people out there who have lost their jobs need help. Though, just in my opinion, I think printing money is only a band-aid. The real solution was in the past. Decades ago, societies and nations should have focused on wealth creation instead of excessive housing, financialization, and gambling. That is, banks should have made loans to productive areas of society, small and medium businesses, entrepreneurs, education, manufacturing, innovation, research and development, all of these kind of things. Just imagine how our world would be today if banks invested hundreds of billions of dollars into these kind of things instead of property or gambling on if the price of something will go up or down. Just imagine. It's riskier for the banks, but the benefits lead to more jobs, more innovation, better competition, and better living standards in the long run. Also, governments can collect more taxes from these incomes without necessarily raising taxes. These extra taxes from generally higher living standards can then be spent on social programs to help those who are truly in need. You can print money, but you can't print wealth. But focusing on wealth creation and productivity takes time, effort, and hard work, and it just seems today that people don't have the appetite for that. And frankly, it's too late for this option. If we focused on funding wealth creation before COVID hit, all of our economies would be much less fragile. Most individuals and businesses would have a healthy amount of savings to ride it out, like in the late 20th century. But for now, we're just going to have to deal with the consequences of a fragile system. So what's going to happen next? In my view, I think this is all going to lead to something very big and unpleasant over the next decade. I don't know how it's going to look like, but it may involve massive amounts of inflation and slow economic growth. A situation known as stagflation. This happened in the 1970s, but this time it could be much worse due to excessive amounts of debt with the added effect of social instability. The mainstream view is that eventually the world will lose faith in the US dollar, though some macroeconomists think that the American dollar may actually rise in value as other nations try to sell their goods or exchange falling currencies for the US dollar because it's the cleanest economy out of a world of falling economies. This is called the dollar milkshake theory. Some people think that digital stablecoins will be able to solve a lot of problems. There are others still who argue that nations can print infinite amounts of money just as long as they keep producing enough goods to pay the interest on the debt that the government owes the central banks. The argument here is that the debt actually never has to be paid back, only the interest. This is called modern monetary theory. I can't comment on if this will work or not. I don't think anyone can, because it's never been tried before. But I can't help but think that this looks like another fragile solution. Small communities in Venezuela and a small town in Italy have taken the power back themselves and just issued their own currency. All in all, who knows what's going to work? I have no idea. On the bright side, all of the events to come might spawn massive reform. As I did learn while writing my book, out of the worst circumstances, the best innovations arise. So what can the individual do? Obviously, I can't give financial advice, I'm definitely not qualified for that. But it might be worth thinking about converting some of your money into other assets that aren't debt-based, as a form of insurance. If you're older, you may be thinking about gold, since no central bank can print gold. Bank of America and even Goldman Sachs, the last people on earth who you would think to be positive, are seeing gold's potential and they're calling it the money of last resort. Even other central banks like China and Russia have been buying gold in record amounts for years. I think they understand what's about to happen. If you're younger, you may be attracted to cryptocurrencies. Governments and the banking system are starting to take the technology seriously now. If you're more daring, you can play the central bank's game against them. Study and invest in the assets that you think they'll cause to rise in price. Ultimately, I can't tell you what to do here. You have to think for yourself and research to find out what you believe is best. The way money is created and the overall banking system seems like madness, and people have started to notice that the system is no longer working. The monetary system is so ingrained and so pervasive, it becomes invisible to see. Nobody ever questioned it. When things started going wrong, they pointed at the things that were visible, things that look like problems, surface issues which you could see and understand. Looking at the surface, some would point the finger at capitalism, but you have to dig deeper. And when you do, you can see it's an unfortunate and untimely mix of the debt-based system, extreme financialization, moral hazards, and a rampant Cantillon effect that's causing extreme fragility and ever-increasing amounts of massive wealth inequality. Hi, welcome to another episode of Cold Fusion. This is Forbes magazine on the 14th of February 2023. The title of this particular article reads, America's Best Banks. An entity by the name of Silicon Valley Bank was ranked number 20 and has been on the list for 5 years in a row. Founded in 1983, SVB was the 16th largest bank in the United States and had over $209 billion in assets. Yet, in a few short weeks, the bank would go up in flames over the course of a couple of days.
Silicon Valley Bank's collapse set off a panic not seen since the days of the financial meltdown of 2008.
The collapse of Silicon Valley Bank is causing shockwaves across the entire business world.
With the FDIC now in control, customers can access up to $250,000 on Monday. But as ABC's Jacqueline Lee explains, that's not enough for many companies left struggling to manage their finances.
This weekend, clients of Silicon Valley Bank are scrambling and imploring the federal government to step in to help recover uninsured deposits over $250,000. It's the largest bank failure since the financial crisis of 2008.
The crash created a cascade of events. Some smaller regional banks lost the majority of their valuation, and another has since collapsed. Companies such as Roblox, Vox Media, and a whole host of Silicon Valley startups are scrambling to find the cash to pay their employees. Meanwhile, the UK government is at work trying to minimize the effects of the crash. And at the same time, the rest of the economy is trying to figure out what the long-term consequences of this disaster may be. This is the largest bank failure since 2008 and the second largest in history. But how did a bank go from making the list of the best banks to bankrupt in less than a month? What happens next? Is this the start of another financial crisis? Maybe not, but there are some risks. What everyone seems to have missed in this story is that it's more of a cautionary tale of mismanagement, incompetence, and political lobbying. The bank's parent company, its CEO and CFO are all being sued for fraud, and the CEO lobbied Congress to remove the very laws that would have prevented this crash in the first place. This whole thing is a crazy story, so let's get into it.
You are watching Cold Fusion TV.
To understand the consequences of this crash, we need to know how it started. Silicon Valley Bank, or SVB, was no ordinary bank. It was the go-to institution for venture capital and tech startups. The bank enjoyed a healthy period of growth during the 2020 pandemic. Low interest rates and excessive money printing from the US Federal Reserve caused the tech sector to boom. Money was easy and investors were generous. At the time, startups were able to raise money easily due to cheap credit. Once the companies got that money, they needed somewhere to store it. This is where Silicon Valley Bank comes in. SVB was very popular among founders. In fact, nearly 50% of all United States startups have some deposits in Silicon Valley Bank. In 2021, SVB saw a massive influx in deposits, from around $61 billion at the end of 2019 to around $189 billion at the end of 2021. Now, SVB wanted to make a larger profit from all of this cash that they were suddenly sitting on. A safe investment would be long-term bonds. These are usually seen as safer than stocks and provide a steady return. Here's why. When interest rates are low, newly issued bonds pay lower interest rates or returns, making existing long-term bonds that pay higher more attractive. This leads to an increase in demand for these bonds and an increase in their price. So whoever's holding these long-term bonds makes money. SVB saw this situation and invested $80 billion of their tech company deposits in long-term bonds and other securities. They could then turn around and pay depositors a lower rate. The difference between the high rates from their long-term bonds and the cost of paying low rates for their deposits would be their profit. This arrangement works particularly well. Even if some clients decided to withdraw sooner, the bank can simply sell the bonds and get the liquidity necessary to pay back the depositor. But what happens when everyone wants to withdraw their money all at once? Silicon Valley Bank was about to find out. As we covered in a previous episode about the 2008 crisis and its aftermath that still affects us today, the post-crisis market isn't used to a high interest rate environment, and higher interest rates could create risks in vulnerable areas of the financial system. The risk management team of SVB ignored this risk, but more on this later. Problems for SVB began brewing in late 2021. In the United States, inflation began to rise. Usually when this happens, the US Federal Reserve would increase interest rates to slow the economy and counteract the inflation. But this time, the US Federal Reserve stood by and did nothing for a while. They told everyone that inflation was transitory. This turned out to be completely wrong, and when the Fed realized their mistake, they had to raise interest rates very quickly to make up for lost time. This whiplash in higher rates didn't allow time for the market to adjust. Meanwhile, at SVB, their investing environment began to flip on its head. As the interest rates rose, the newly issued bonds began to pay higher interest rates, and this made the older long-term bonds less attractive to investors. This resulted in a decline in demand, causing their prices to fall. SVB still owned tens of billions worth of these long-term bonds, so they were a sitting duck for risk. By the end of 2022, there were $15 billion in unrealized losses from the fall in long-term bond prices. Now, normally this isn't an issue, as if SVB held onto these bonds until maturity, they wouldn't lose anything. But this was not a normal time. In a higher interest rate environment, technology startups were struggling to get financing as credit began to dry up. These tech companies needed to dip into their cash to fund their operations. With startups being the main client for SVB, the deposits started to slow down, falling from $189 billion at the end of 2021 to $173 billion at the end of 2022. With every large withdrawal, SVB had to sell some of their long-term bonds to cover the transaction. For some time, the bank had enough liquidity to deal with these withdrawals. As time passed, the depositors continued to leave. On March 8, 2023, SVB made a bombshell announcement. They were selling off their entire liquid bond portfolio worth over $21 billion. Until this point, the falling bond prices were only unrealized losses. That is, losses only on paper. But once sold, SVB took a $1.8 billion loss in the sale. To recoup some losses, management decided to raise some capital. While this seemed like a logical choice, this was a grave error from management. The timing could not have been worse. Just days before, Silvergate, a small crypto-focused bank, failed due to a similar issue. Although this failure had more to do with the exposure to the overall crypto market, and FTX in particular. But the root cause was the same. The bank had a lot of assets which had lost their value due to rising interest rates, and when withdrawals in the crypto market began to happen, they had no choice but to sell those assets. Each sale of the assets was at a lower price than when they bought it. Once the losses piled up, there was no turning back. Investors assumed that SVB was going down the same path. Fears over insolvency issues quickly spread, and this resulted in SVB's stock losing close to 60% of its value in one day. As all of this unfolded, many venture capital firms advised the founders of startups to pull their money out of SVB, further exacerbating the problem. By the end of March 9th, customers have withdrawn $42 billion, leaving the bank with a negative cash balance, about negative $958 million. The withdrawals were so heavy that it ended up crashing the bank's internal system, only creating more fear. Depositors had a reason to panic. In the United States, under the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC, the US government only guarantees refunds up to $250,000. Now the thing is, being a technology company-focused bank, 97% of SVB deposits exceeded this number. The value of Silicon Valley Bank's shares continued to be destroyed until its trading was suspended on the morning of March 10th. They tried to raise capital and failed, and then by midday on March 10th, the bank started to look for a company to bail them out, and no one wanted to touch them. Nobody knew the extent of the problem, so it was a risk. This culminated in SVB being shut down by the FDIC. This all happened on March 10th, less than 2 days after the crisis started. This was a spectacular failure on the side of management. They failed to adjust to a rising interest rate environment. And yes, the US Federal Reserve did get it wrong when they stated that inflation was only transitory. But SVB should have had a contingency plan just in case inflation did stick around. If any of you watching work in risk management, especially in banking, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below on what a contingency plan could have been. It seems that as soon as interest rates started rising, the bank could have began to offload their long-term treasuries and exchange them for bonds yielding higher interest to minimize their losses. Instead, it seems that they waited and sold all of their liquid long-term bonds at once after the value had already fallen. As Bill Ackman states, quote, Silicon Valley Bank senior management made a basic mistake. They invested short-term deposits in longer-term fixed-rate assets. So how could management do such a thing? Well, the story gets a bit wilder the more that you look. As people began to dig deeper into this crash, some new information painted a very worrisome picture. The chief risk officer for Silicon Valley Bank hightailed and left in April of 2022 and wasn't replaced until January of 2023. This meant that the bank had no chief risk officer for 8 months. This was precisely at the time when the downward feedback loop was accelerating from the higher interest rates. Just when the bank's portfolios needed to be rebalanced to account for higher interest rates, there was no one to oversee the process. In other words, the bank was a plane without a pilot during a storm. Just shocking. But it doesn't end there. Worse yet, Silicon Valley Bank's CAO was the CFO of none other than Lehman Brothers at the time of its crash. And you can't help but laugh at how ridiculous this next part is. The Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco was in charge of supervising SVB. And guess who was on the board? The CEO of SVB, Greg Becker. Greg was promptly yeeted from the board after the crash. Interestingly, the CEO, CFO, and CMO of the bank sold a combined $4.4 million of company stock just weeks before SVB's decline. An SEC filing stated that the sale of the shares was, quote, automated and, quote, pre-planned, but it remains unclear if there was some foreknowledge of the collapse. Further to this, the bank's employees received their annual bonuses ranging from $12,000 to $140,000 only hours before the bank's official crash. I can't allege implications of wrongdoing, but there may be a chance that the guys at the top knew something was coming. Right now, SVB is being sued for fraud by shareholders. The lawsuit states that the company failed to disclose how rising interest rates could leave the bank particularly susceptible to a bank run. The crash of SVB was indeed unique. A combination of rapid growth, bad risk management, low interest rates, excessive exposure to only one market, and large deposits with no FDIC insurance have all led us to this point. But is this the start of something bigger for the financial system? Is it a Lehman moment? It may very well have been a Lehman moment for regional banks, as they have similar characteristics to SVB. Their clients are businesses. They operate in a very limited number of fields, and they all have some exposure to unrealized losses in this higher interest rate environment. Because of this, the stocks of First Bank Republic, Western Alliance Bancorp, and Westpac Bancorp, and other regional banks have all seen large declines, some as much as 66% in a day. Many hedge funds have also started to short sell.
Yeah, worst week since 2020 last week, John, and this week is not starting out on a better note, despite the fact that depositors of both Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank are going to be made whole, and the Fed has announced this new bank term lending facility that is going to lend to banks at extremely favorable rates. That is not helping the regional banks this morning. Clearly, there is still fear out there about this spreading elsewhere. Just take a look at the shares of First Republic, down 65% here at the opening bell. This is on top of a 33% loss last week. A week ago, this was $122 stock. This morning, it is trading at $28 a share. That is how brutal this wipeout has been, John, and it's elsewhere in the regional banks as well. PacWest, Western Alliance, Zion.
The falls in the stock prices were so drastic that the trading of a slew of these banks had to be halted. Okay, so this next part is key. Right at this moment, the rest of the banking system seems to be largely unaffected. As one analyst at Barclays wrote, quote, deposit pressure is the greatest for smaller banks, including regionals. Global banks have more diverse funding sources and therefore are less vulnerable to that risk. That being said, Bank of America does have large exposure to long-term bonds that are planned to be held to maturity. Though if they don't sell and actually hold these bonds to maturity, this shouldn't be a problem. Many are comparing this situation to that of the 2008 financial crisis. Yet this is quite different. During that time, some of the largest banks in the US all failed simultaneously, and they had much bigger issues to deal with. These banks had sizable investments in assets that overnight became worthless. The assets that are responsible for the crash of SVB are not worthless. In fact, far from it. They're backed by the US government, and if held to maturity, in theory, they're not going to lose any value. The problem for SVB is that they sold all of these bonds early and realized those losses, tried to raise funds to cover those losses, and that triggered a panic. Another difference resides in the fact that the banks in 2008 had huge leverage issues. In the case of Lehman Brothers, for example, the leverage exceeded 30 times the underlying assets. In other words, a decline of 3 to 5% in those assets meant that Lehman Brothers was completely bankrupt. And lastly, the big banks have a far greater degree of diversification than regional banks. This means that they can withstand liquidity shocks more easily, as generally, not every single sector gets impacted at the same time. Not only this, but the bigger banks will probably benefit from the collapse of regional banks. Depositors may move their money from regional banks to larger institutions. And if there are more bank failures, the larger banks can simply gobble up the healthy parts for pennies on the dollar. Does this mean that the risk of a financial crisis is non-existent? Well, not really. While the current financial system is very different from the one in 2008, there is still a chance that this may be the first crack in the fabrics of the current financial system. As of December 2022, the total unrealized losses for the whole banking system was close to $620 billion. If panic spreads too much, many small banks will go down as a result, creating a cascading effect that would cause the rest of the economy to wobble. The Federal Reserve and the financial sectors of the US government have recognized this and have come up with a solution, which we'll get to shortly. The industry that will feel the most pain is going to be the tech sector. SVB, quote, was the lifeblood of the tech ecosystem, states Roy Khanna, a congressman from California's 17th district. Tens of thousands of startups rely on them to pay their day-to-day operations, including staff. You see, unlike traditional businesses, many of these tech companies have negative cash flows. The only way that they can pay their expenses is by raising capital. After the capital has been obtained, they store it and use it until the next raise. If you take that stored money away, very quickly, many of these firms start to fail. Several firms aren't going to be able to pay their employees. And if there's further delays in when the money is returned, a huge wave of layoffs and then eventually bankruptcies will follow. Etsy had to delay their seller payouts. The streaming company Roku held a quarter of its cash reserves in SVB. Roblox, Rocket Lab, Circle, Vox Media, and Vimeo are among countless companies affected. The CEO of Y Combinator, Gary Tan, puts it best, quote, "This is an extinction-level event for startups and will set back their innovation by 10 years or more." Confidence in the finance industry has been shaken. US banks lost a combined $100 billion and $50 billion for the valuation of European banks. On the 13th of March, Joe Biden had to reassure the United States population.
Look, the bottom line is this. Americans can rest assured that our banking system is safe. Your deposits are safe. Let me also assure you, we will not stop at this. We'll do whatever is needed.
The situation also spread to the UK. The Bank of England was looking for ways to minimize the damage. The United Kingdom also had an arm of Silicon Valley Bank. Then, on March 13th, HSBC bought the stricken UK entity for a measly £1 or $1.21. At the height of the chaos, 200 UK firms confirmed that they weren't going to be able to pay their staff. On the other side of the world, Chinese startups also reported issues accessing their funds. SVB was especially popular among Chinese biotech startups. As one founder explained, quote, "We tried everything Friday morning, but it was already too late. The transfer is still processing. It's very crazy. We didn't think this could happen." For Chinese groups, their ecosystem was already damaged by Beijing's tech crackdown and COVID-19 pandemic controls, not to mention the rising geopolitical tensions with Washington. So in all of this, where were the regulators? Well, being lobbied apparently. Back in 2015, SVB's CEO begged lawmakers to exempt banks with assets less than $250 billion from the tough supervision and regulations of the Dodd-Frank Act. For those who remember my 2008 episode, this act was put into place to stop another financial crisis. In 2018, a bill was passed that weakened this act, and Greg Becker got his wish. Saul Omarova, professor of law at Cornell University, who testified before the Senate against relaxing regulations for smaller banks, said that the 2018 bill, quote, "should not have passed." And he was spot on. The dust has only just started to settle. Silicon Valley Bank is now under FDIC control, and the FDIC has since moved SVB deposits to a newly formed holding bank and named Tim Mayopoulos as CEO. On March 12, 2023, another regional bank, Signature Bank, collapsed.
Meanwhile, Signature Bank marks the third largest bank failure in U.S. history.
Seeing more possible bank failures on the horizon, the Federal Reserve had to do something unprecedented. They announced the creation of a bank term funding program to shore up liquidity for other at-risk banks. They're allowing the affected banks to sell their long-term bonds and securities to the Fed without a loss. In another announcement on the same day, the Treasury, Federal Reserve, and FDIC stated that all depositors, even the uninsured ones, will be made whole without the expenditure of taxpayer money. Some financial commentators have said that this is an inflationary move. A lot of regional banks who use the same style of banking as SVB saw worried depositors piling up outside to get their money out. The Fed and US government had to do these drastic moves to avoid bank runs and a cascade of bankruptcies. Nobody is a fan of government-assisted bailouts, but this is a tough situation. As Simon Johnson, an economist at MIT who previously served as the chief economist of the IMF, says, quote, "All choices are bad choices. You don't want to extend this kind of bailout to people, but if you aren't doing that, you face a run of really big and really hard to predict proportions." This is the largest banking failure since the financial crisis. If the Fed's creation of the Bank Term Funding Program isn't as smooth as promised or takes too long, the consequences for the companies around the US could be devastating. Even though I think the Federal Reserve does have some blame for the background macroeconomic situation, they did need to do something. Further to this, if the Federal Reserve reverses course and starts cutting interest rates, inflation could ramp up again, causing even more havoc. They're stuck between a rock and a hard place. Raise rates, destroy the economy. Cut rates also destroy the economy. With Silicon Valley holding 50% of US VC-backed startups as customers, 65,000 startups would be affected by the collapse. Even if the government does succeed in making each depositor whole, it's a sad time for the tech sector, as confidence has been shaken. The nightmare of being locked out of company cash, delays in paying staff, and countless administration issues will leave a scar. In summary, this is a story of rapidly changing market conditions, risk management failure, and lobbying. But zooming out even further, this is exactly the kind of risk I was talking about in my 2008 episode. In the third section of that video, I talked about how unhealthy this economy has been ever since the crash. The post-crisis economy has been built on a scaffolding of easy money and low interest rates. When these conditions reverse, we'll start to see that weak scaffolding start to shake. What happened here is proof right in our faces. It will be the weaker and badly managed sectors of the economy that start to show it first. But what happens after that is anyone's guess. You should definitely watch that episode if you haven't already. I think you'll get a lot out of it. So this SVB story is still unfolding. We can only wait and see what the longer term impacts will be. So that's about it from me. Thanks for watching. If you did enjoy this, take a look around on the channel. There's plenty of interesting stuff on here. Alright, my name is Dagogo, and you have been watching Cold Fusion, and I'll catch you again soon for the next episode. Cheers guys. Have a good one.
Cold Fusion. It's new thinking.
It's a very historic moment in global banking history.
Investors clearly question the solidity of the entire banking system in the Western world.
Once a titan on Wall Street, Credit Suisse has been hit by a series of missteps and compliance failures over the last few years that have damaged its reputation with both clients and investors.
Hi, welcome to another episode of Cold Fusion. Less than a week after the crash of 3 US banks, a financial panic seemed to spread over to Europe, hitting the weakest link in the chain, Credit Suisse. The buyout of the Swiss giant has marked arguably the most severe event in banking since the 2008 crisis. While the failure is part of a much larger problem with confidence in the banking sector, the truth is that its demise was no surprise to people in the industry. In fact, Credit Suisse could be called one of the worst large banks in existence. From shaky financials, fraud, and money laundering, to hiring spies and a mysterious death of a private investigator, Credit Suisse was the problematic child of the European financial system. It got caught up in virtually every scandal and found itself in multiple bombshell cases in the recent past. But how exactly did one of the biggest banks in Europe go from being a well-respected institution to being a complete mess? And more importantly, what are the after effects of the collapse of Credit Suisse? This is the story of Credit Suisse and its inevitable demise.
You are watching Cold Fusion TV.
Credit Suisse was founded in 1856 by politician and businessman Alfred Escher. Its initial purpose was to fund Switzerland's first railway system and avoid dependence on the French banking system. The bank played a major role in its country's industrial development. It financed infrastructure projects, such as the construction of the first electric grid, while also aiding in the development of the Swiss currency. They expanded their operations throughout the latter half of the 19th century, providing banking services to the Swiss middle class and establishing their presence in the United States. After the decimation of Europe in World War II, Credit Suisse was instrumental in restructuring Europe's economy, and they acquired several other Swiss banks in the process. When their presence all over Europe was established, they were able to become one of the most respected and prestigious financial institutions in the world. But even during these early days of business, there were some signs of things to come. For instance, in a quiet Italian branch of the business, local authorities found out that the client's cash was channeled off the books, aiding them with tax evasion. Despite the minor hiccups, the bank was able to maintain its reputation, and throughout the 1980s and 90s, it continued to expand its global operations. Through a series of mergers and acquisitions, they became a powerhouse of European and even world banking. The rapid growth also bred a new culture. Risk be damned. It's growth at all costs. More customers meant bigger profits, and therein lied their focus. This also created dangerous behaviors and eventually led to major controversies, including the 2006 involvement of hiding Iranian transactions from US authorities. Despite that, once the 2008 crisis arrived, the firm was much more prepared than most banks for what was about to happen. While still engaged in the mortgage market that sank the rest of the financial world, they were able to escape without needing any government help despite steep losses, something that didn't happen to their closest competitor, UBS. UBS is going to play a key role in this story later on, but we'll get to that. In the following years after the 2008 crash, the bank recovered, but again, its reputation was put into question as more scandals regarding tax evasion emerged. Probes into its operation were launched, and some former employees were arrested in Brazil, the US, and Germany. And this was all only the beginning. In 2014, US authorities found that for decades, the firm destroyed bank records and concealed transactions involving undeclared accounts. Attorney General Eric Holder would state, quote, "They failed to take even the most basic steps to ensure compliance with tax laws." Credit Suisse was found guilty and had to pay a fine of $2.5 billion. To put this into perspective, this was the largest bank to plead guilty to a criminal charge in more than 2 decades. The toxic culture within the company had fully taken hold, and it was going to be hard to reverse. Following the incident, both the chairman and CEO of the bank were forced to resign, leaving a hot seat for anyone who came after them. It only took 2 years in 2016 for Credit Suisse to be back to their old tricks. This time, they caused an economic crisis in Mozambique. The Swiss firm, along with a Russian investment bank, VTB Capital, gave $2 billion worth of backdoor loans to the country. The funds were supposed to be for maritime-related projects, but ended up being misappropriated. Some of the funds ended up in the Mozambique military. Once the secret loans were discovered, financial aid from the IMF and others ceased. The nation's currency plummeted, inflation roared, and an economic crisis ensued. 3 former Credit Suisse bankers were arrested in the US and UK for fraud and money laundering. It was a careless disaster that affected the lives of countless people in Mozambique. The reputation of Credit Suisse was in shambles, but there was one man who thought he was fit for the job to bring the company back to its former glory. His name was Jane Thiam, a former head of one of the largest insurance companies in Britain. With the nomination, the new CEO began by setting his 3-year restructuring plan in motion, and surprisingly, the plan worked. In 2018, for the first time in 4 years, the company had a profit. Although, despite how successful the plan was financially, more scandals plagued the Swiss bank. The internal culture only got worse. And ironically, this was the time that upper management caused a national-level incident. We're talking about the infamous espionage scandal. You see, in 2019, the former head of wealth management for Credit Suisse left the company to work for UBS, which was located just a few blocks away. It then came to light that he was being followed by a private investigator. And later on, the police found out that the spy was hired by none other than the CEO of Credit Suisse himself. UBS was a rival bank, so he didn't want Khan taking any Credit Suisse employees or clients and bringing them over to UBS. After the incident, the firm played down the episode and called it an isolated act, but Switzerland's financial regulators disagreed. According to them, Credit Suisse planned and carried out most of 7 different spying operations between 2016 and 2019, and then something extremely suspicious happened. Days after opening an official trial, the private investigator hired to trail Khan mysteriously died, committing suicide. None of the executives were found guilty, despite everyone knowing that the CEO of Credit Suisse, Jane Thiam, had hired these spies. Despite no convictions, the scandal was too large to ignore, and so the chairman, the head of the bank security, and later the CEO all had to resign.
I did not order directly or indirectly that action.
Do you feel like you need to rebuild trust with some of your constituents?
No, not from what I can see.
But you haven't had clients actually question by pulling out money.
No,
it hasn't had any impact like that.
Zero impact. Zero impact.
Once again, the bank was in need of a new restructuring plan. Yet by the time the new CEO, Thomas Gottstein, got to work, the pandemic stock market craze was slowing down. And now, companies that relied too much on leverage in their financial operations were in trouble. 2 of the main culprits that affected Credit Suisse were Greensill Capital and the infamous Archegos Capital, and we've done a full episode on the latter. Both firms collapsed after one another. Archegos had risky bets on a concentrated selection of stocks. When the price dropped, they defaulted on their margin calls. This resulted in a fire sale of stocks that led to billions of dollars in losses in banks. Credit Suisse was the worst hit. Greensill Capital, on the other hand, was a supply chain finance company that collapsed due to poor risk management. It was later found out that Credit Suisse was not only investing in these firms, but it also allowed them to engage in risky activities, landing them millions of dollars. In a legal document about the case, it was stated that, quote, "The Archegos-related losses sustained by Credit Suisse are the result of a fundamental failure of management and controls in Credit Suisse's investment bank, and specifically its prime services division. The business was focused on maximizing short-term profits and failed to rein in, and indeed enabled, Archegos' voracious risk-taking." The series of disasters culminated in Credit Suisse losing $15 billion in a single quarter. This was a dire situation, and the bank needed yet another new leader to sort this out. The man for the job was Antonio Horta Osorio. He was a former Leeds Banking Group CEO and was selected as the new chairman in May of 2021. With a reputation for managing successful turnarounds, Antonio decided to go to the heart of Credit Suisse. He wanted to change the culture and bring better risk management. And as you've guessed, his promise didn't stand the test of time. He was forced to resign less than a year later because he broke quarantine rules. Although he had something very interesting to say about the company. He said that Credit Suisse was worse than anything he'd experienced running several banks in his 35-year career. This situation created a lack of confidence in the bank, making their shares slide 50% since the peak before the SPI scandal. As it turns out, Antonio may have actually been lucky, because 2022 would prove to be a nightmare for the firm. In February, a major leak revealed that dozens of international entities publicly known for their involvement in human rights abuses, drug trafficking, corruption, money laundering, and other serious crimes all had their funds stashed away in Credit Suisse. The total sum of their deposits exceeded $100 billion. In March, Credit Suisse had to pay $500 million in damages over a fraud case at its Bermuda insurance arm. In June, the Swiss bank was found guilty in a money laundering case involving a cocaine trafficking ring in Bulgaria. And with all of that, the company's reputation was in complete shambles. And by the end of 2022, many financial advisors even began to recommend that clients take their money out of the firm, as things were only going to get worse. Around this time, rumors began to surface that the company was in distress, and by the end of the year, the bank had registered more than $100 billion in customer deposit outflow. The CEO was once again replaced, and a new restructuring plan put in motion. But at this stage, who really thought this was going to work? As 2023 rolled around, a new set of macroeconomic conditions sent the company on a new trajectory. This time, they would not recover. It all started on March 14th, days after the demise of Silicon Valley Bank. Credit Suisse delayed their annual report, but when it finally arrived, the bank admitted to, quote, material weakness in its financial controls. On top of that, a laundry list of fines and criminal settlements had come back to bite the bank. They reported an annual loss of more than $7 billion. Morningstar banking analyst Johann Schultz explains it best. Quote, regarding the financial reporting controls issue, it seems that it could not have come for a worse time for Credit Suisse. As we have once again seen with the SVB debacle, trust and confidence are everything in banking. Credit Suisse was already under pressure from its depositors, and other funding providers lost confidence, leading to substantial withdrawals in Q4 of 2022. As clients started to pull their money out, another blow hit the bank. One of its biggest shareholders, the Saudi National Bank, stated publicly that it would not provide the bank with more liquidity. Once the news hit, the stock of Credit Suisse dropped 24% in a day. The Swiss National Bank could no longer stay out of it. If Credit Suisse went down, the Swiss economy and reputation would be gravely injured. And so, in a desperate attempt to reassure the public, the Swiss National Bank injected close to $50 billion in the distressed firm. Unfortunately for them, the move did not work. Major financial institutions were cutting ties with the Swiss giant, and client withdrawals at one point reached $10 billion per day.
It is down an incredible 60% in morning trading, so essentially losing more than half of its market capitalization.
That was the biggest loss since the global financial crisis back in 2008.
As Friday closed, the Swiss government knew that they needed a solution, otherwise the prospects were grim. The entire financial system of Europe would be at risk. As such, they began to look for a bank to buy out the distressed Credit Suisse. At this point, it's important to remember that the Swiss are a very closed and proud state. Selling one of its biggest banks to a foreign firm was never really on the table. Due to the massive size of Credit Suisse, the only viable option was its main rival, UBS. Contrary to Credit Suisse, UBS had been doing quite well over the past few years. They had $7.6 billion in profit in 2022 and had good confidence from investors. Their stock had even rose 24% over the past few years. They looked like a great candidate, and the deal was made.
Global investment firm UBS has agreed to take over its competitor, Credit Suisse.
After much debate, the final form of the deal was drafted. It involved a 60% plus discount on the closing price of Credit Suisse and $100 billion in liquidity for the losses for UBS. And on March 19th, the deal was made public. After 167 years of history, Credit Suisse ceased its operations. The controversial deal was able to save the Swiss economy and its beloved banking sector. Yet many people are raising questions over the legitimacy of state involvement in the negotiation of the deal. According to the reports, UBS and Credit Suisse executives did not meet over the weekend to discuss the deal. It was the government and the Swiss central bank that orchestrated the move behind the scenes. But that's not the main issue. The true problem is how the deal was made. UBS is a public company, and as such, its shareholders have to approve major decisions. It takes 6 days to have an emergency conference and reach an agreement. But this time, the government made an exception that allowed UBS to override that rule. The move was particularly unpopular with the parliament of the country. After all, under Switzerland's political system, parliament is needed to ratify emergency decisions by the government, something that didn't happen this time around. The Social Democratic Party has already promised to vote for a special parliament inquiry to hold the banks and the government's feet to the flame. And this sentiment is almost universally held across the political spectrum. If the situation keeps escalating, we might witness a political upheaving in the making. As for UBS, while the deal seems like a bargain, eliminating their competition and solidifying them as the biggest bank in Switzerland, the truth may be different. New reports seem to indicate that over half the Swiss population is against the merger of the two banks. The cultures within the two firms are completely distinct, so a split should not be off the table for UBS. However, arguably, the most worrisome part for UBS is the effects that this deal would have on its reputation. The US Department of Justice is already looking into the former Credit Suisse's involvement in helping Russian oligarchs evade sanctions. UBS is likely going to find a lot of skeletons in Credit Suisse's closet, and the Swiss banking system may lose what's left of its reputation. As for the rest of the world, the confidence in the banking system has only gotten worse. Europeans are looking out for the next weak spot. Even if a bank has all the required ratios in place, it can easily go down if enough withdrawals are made at once. So far, it seems like the next in line is Deutsche Bank. Stuart Cole, head macroeconomist at Equity Capital, said, quote, "It has been in the spotlight for a while now, in a similar way to how Credit Suisse has been. It has gone through various restructurings and changes of leaderships in attempts to get it back on a solid footing, but so far, none of these efforts appear to have worked. So we should keep an eye out to see what happens with that firm." This whole situation should have central banks and governments around the world looking closely. They can act fast and break the rules, saving the economy while infuriating the masses, or act slowly and possibly blow up their entire economy in the process. They'll all be looking closely to see what happens in Swiss politics in the future. So there you have it, the story of the rise and fall of Credit Suisse. From one of the most respected banks to money laundering, fraud, spying, and a complete collapse. Let me know what you guys thought in the comment section below. Anyway, that's about it from me. My name is Dagogo, and you have been watching Cold Fusion, and I'll catch you again soon for the next episode. Cheers, guys. Have a good one.
Cold Fusion. It's new thinking.
Hi, welcome to another episode of Cold Fusion. 2008 was a pretty interesting year. It was my first year of university, the iPhone was 1 year old, dubstep was about to explode, and Breaking Bad changes television. But what most people remember from 2008 was the financial disaster that came with it. The world would go through one of the biggest crises it had ever witnessed. $19.2 trillion of household wealth would be lost, and some of the biggest financial institutions in the world would fail. The crisis would mark everyone who lived through it. Without knowing it, many have had their lives determined by this recession. From the backlash against globalization to the erosion of trust in governments, financial institutions, and each other, it can all be traced back to this point in time. Since the recession, less people are having kids and it's been harder to get by. And I'm even talking before COVID. The 2008 crisis was the death of the real economy. After that point, there was less productivity and more money printing and low interest rates, which disproportionately helped the richest people. With the way the global economy is looking today, it's increasingly important to look back at this point in history to understand exactly what happened and the parallels it has to today. This special episode will be split into 3 parts. First, I'll take you through the setup of the disaster, then the crash, then the death of the real economy, and I'll finish with what you can do to help yourself. Let's begin the story of one of the biggest events in human history.
You are watching Cold Fusion TV.
To get the full picture, we need to go back to America in 1995. During this year, the fight was on to help low-income earners. The US government passed laws to decrease discrimination against poorer home borrowers. The banks would lower lending requirements, offering packages such as reduced payments for a number of years. Soon after, in 1999, the US government repealed a law that stopped commercial banks from taking part in investment banking activities. The law that they got rid of was the Glass-Steagall Act. Ironically, this law was made in 1933 to stop the speculation that fueled the Great Depression. It was a fatal mistake. From 1999 onwards, banks which had previously managed conservatively turned to riskier and riskier investments, as well as speculation, all in an effort to increase their returns. Banks cared less about their customers and more about Wall Street profits. According to Nobel economics laureate Joseph Stiglitz, this move played a major role in the financial collapse that was to come. But why worry? Right now, things were good. It was the late 1990s, and there were seemingly no economic problems in sight for America. The internet had taken over the minds of everyone. Investment banks were throwing money behind anything that had a .com at the end. The result was the launch of stupid companies like Pets.com. The banks didn't care though. When the stock went up, they would sell and make their profit. This was the .com bubble, and it had arrived in full force. People quit their jobs to trade stocks, and shares went crazy. For example, shares of Qualcomm rose by 2,619% in 1999 alone. In America, there was money to be made, and life was good. But something started to happen. Soon investors realized that these internet companies had no cash flow and couldn't actually make any money. And by March 2000, it all came crashing down. The next year, the September 11th attacks would occur, followed by the Enron and WorldCom corporate accounting scandals. After these events, the public and the markets lost trust in the economy. Spending trended downwards, and it was looking like the economy was heading for a recession. To avoid this, the Central Bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve, decided to lower interest rates down to 1%. The low interest rates would increase spending and recover confidence in the American economy. With a low 1% interest rate and no systemic problems in the real economy, the recovery was rapid and economic growth was ample. Eventually, speculation started to migrate from stocks into real estate. By 2003, everyone with a good credit score and a good job already owned a home. If you were in the business of giving out home loans, this was a bad sign. To save their profit margins, mortgage lenders relaxed credit scores to get more people in the door and increase profits. These were called subprime loans. As the money flowed in and time went on, the lending standards got lower and lower and lower. Soon there were mortgage deals that required no income, no job, and no assets.
They stopped checking whether the income was even real. They turned to low and no doc loans, so-called liar's loans. No income, no job, no assets, and they were still willing to lend.
But help me out here. How does that make sense for the lender? It would seem to be reckless in the extreme.
It was, but the key assumption was that home prices would keep going up forever. And in fact, home prices nationwide had never declined since the Great Depression.
People like acupuncturist Rula Giosmas became real estate speculators.
How many properties did you buy in this last 5-year period?
I believe in the last 5-year period, I bought about 6 properties.
And what did you buy them for?
For investments.
If a subprime customer defaulted, it was no problem. Just sell the house because it was going to go up in value, so you're going to still make a profit. So this next part is a bit in the weeds, but I need you to bear with me because it's crucial to the story. So Wall Street was looking at this situation and they saw an opportunity. You see, there were 2 groups of people that could be linked here. On the one side were the mortgage lenders who were profiting from a newly found market. They wanted to get rid of these risky loans because they knew that these loans were junk and had a huge liability. On the other hand, you had institutional investors who were looking for ways to increase their returns. Since interest rates were low at 1%, high-yield products were off the table. The Wall Street banks had an idea, and they got to work offering the perfect high-yielding product, the mortgage-backed security. These are a bundle of individual mortgage debts sold as shares. These shares would give back the investors that bought them a safe, fixed income. Some rather devious bankers realized that they could use an old financial tool in combination with mortgage-backed securities to make unimaginable amounts of money. If they used this tool in the housing market, they could make tens of billions of dollars in just months. This tool was the CDO, collateralized debt obligation. To give you an idea of how lovely these products were, the bank that invented them went bankrupt due to a massive insider trading scandal. One way to imagine a CDO product is to think of it as a box. This box gets filled with monthly repayments from a group of mortgages and other debt, such as car loans and student loans. The box can generate income to investors who buy it. It's divided into different levels. Each level represents a different risk.
A CDO works like 3 cascading trays. As money comes in, the top tray fills first, then spills over into the middle, and whatever is left into the bottom. The money comes from homeowners paying off their mortgages. If some owners don't pay and default on their mortgage, less money comes in and the bottom tray may not get filled. This makes the bottom tray riskier and the top tray safer. To compensate for the higher risk, the bottom tray receives a higher rate of return, while the top receives a lower, but still nice return.
The aim of this was to diversify the risk, but there was a fatal flaw. Since the box had safe prime home loans mixed in with loans to people who had no job, the whole thing was risky. All of the risk was passed to investors who purchased these debt boxes. Meanwhile, the lenders and the banks profited handsomely by charging high fees.
This system was a ticking time bomb. Lenders didn't care anymore about whether a borrower could repay, so they started making riskier loans. The investment banks didn't care either. The more CDOs they sold, the higher their profits.
As the financial assets became more complex and harder to value, the majority didn't understand how these instruments worked. They turned to credit rating agencies for clarity. The hope was that these institutions would do their homework for them and determine risk correctly. But as it goes, the rating agencies completely screwed up. They rated these debt boxes as AAA, the highest possible rating. This signaled that they were extremely safe, good enough for pension funds and the wider economy to invest in. But there's a question remaining. Why did the rating agencies rate these debt boxes as high quality? Well, sadly, it was because the rating agencies made billions of dollars in doing so. If a bank came to them asking to rate their box filled with junk, a rating agency would know that if they gave the product the true junk rating, the banks would just go to another rating agency down the road to get the AAA rating they desired. Rating all of these boxes AAA meant that the money kept flowing into the rating agencies. This was another key component to the disaster. These false ratings would later spread America's problems to the rest of the world. Between 2000 and 2007, the subprime mortgage debt included in the packages increased from 5% to 36%. They saw remarkable success, growing from an estimated $20 billion in 2004 to over $180 billion in 2007. Bankers were personally making millions to tens of millions in bonuses. While this was going on, there were some mad scientists in the financial industry that were creating financial weapons of mass destruction. This is where things go insane, and the greed was in full swing. The final stage of the greed was the invention of the mortgage credit default swap. This was a financial instrument that worked as insurance against failed mortgage debt products.
So it's an insurance contract.
It is an insurance contract, but they've been very careful not to call it that, because if it were insurance, it would be regulated.
This is actually the security.
This is the selling document for the securities.
Think anybody ever read this stuff?
I doubt very many people read it.
These complex financial instruments were actually designed by mathematicians and physicists who used algorithms and computer models to reconstitute the unreliable loans in ways that were supposed to eliminate most of the risk.
Obviously, they turned out to be wrong.
Why?
Because you can't model human behavior with math.
They are complex, in effect, mortgage science projects devised by these Nobel-track physicists who came to work on Wall Street.
And it didn't stop Wall Street from making billions selling them to banks, pension funds, and other institutional investors all over the world.
How big is the market for credit default swaps?
We really don't know. There's this voluntary survey that claims that the market is in the range of 50 to 60 or so trillion dollars. It's sort of alarming that in a market that big, we don't even know how big it is to within, say, $10 trillion.
This enabled banks to bet on the direction of a mortgage price. If they guessed right, they would make a bunch of money.
Think of it for a moment as a football game. People in the stands may also have a financial stake in the outcome in the form of a bet with a friend or a bookie.
The new bet that arose over the last several years is a bet based on whether people will default on their mortgages.
And that was the bet that blew up Wall Street.
And crazier still, banks could bet on the outcome of the previous bet, and banks could bet on the bet of that bet. Because these are swaps, and technically not insurance, the banks didn't need any cash to back up their bets if they go bad. What could possibly go wrong?
And it used to be illegal. It was very illegal 100 years ago because it had brought down the market in 1907. And they said, we're not going to let this happen again. And then 100 years later, in 2000, we rolled them all back.
In retrospect, giving Wall Street immunity from state gambling laws and legalizing activity that had been banned for most of the 20th century should have given lawmakers pause.
If it sounds meaningless, it basically is. These products created no value in the economy, but were making banks a whole bunch of money. Insurance companies, such as AIG, saw their profits soar. Financial engineering was running rampant, and there was no one supervising any of these products. In October 2004, the Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC, bizarrely relaxed the liquidity requirements of 5 banks: Goldman Sachs, Merrill Lynch, Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, and Morgan Stanley. This lit the fire.
The more the banks borrowed, the higher their leverage.
The SEC somehow decided to let investment banks gamble a lot more. That was nuts. I don't know why they did that.
From 2004 to 2007, these investment banks each significantly increased their financial leverage. This amplified gains, but also amplified losses. As they gambled more, these banks became extremely vulnerable to financial shocks. In 2007, they reported $4.1 trillion in debt. That was about 30% of US GDP at the time. The stage was now fully set for a moment that would shake the world. During 2004, as the US economy picked up pace, the US central bank started to increase interest rates. This would set off a chain reaction event because financial institutions had offered up many adjustable rate loans based on low rates. Homebuyers would enjoy these low rates for about 2 to 3 years. After this period, the rates would reset to align with the market interest rate. But when you combine rising rates with low-income subprime customers, it was a disaster. Homebuyers went from paying little to no monthly interest payments to their payments suddenly snapping up to multiple times higher to meet the market. Many just couldn't pay up.
But after 2, 3, or 5 years, those rates reset. They went up, and so did the monthly payment. So a mortgage of, say, $800 a month could easily jump to $1,500.
By mid-2006, an increasing number of defaults caused home prices to fall. Homes were now worth less than their mortgage loans. Many homeowners stopped paying their mortgages and went into foreclosure. This is where the crisis starts gaining momentum. As more foreclosures occurred, home prices fell further, while demand kept decreasing as well. As 2007 got underway, nearly 1.3 million properties were foreclosed. There was a rumbling that something big was going on when the subprime specialist lender, New Century Financial, files for bankruptcy. Then, one subprime lender after another files for bankruptcy. By the end of 2007, 2.3 million homes had been foreclosed, and the subprime mortgage crisis was officially underway. The high default rates by the homeowners led to a rapid devaluation of the financially engineered products from before. Investors were now aware of the risks, and they were now trying to sell these toxic debt boxes at all costs. In March of 2007, Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke tries to calm the markets. He states, "The subprime loan issue is contained." He couldn't have been more wrong. Ironically, in October 2022, Ben Bernanke would win the Nobel Prize for Economics. You're about to see why this is so ironic. In August of 2007, a bombshell announcement rattles the market. France's BNP Paribas announces that there is no liquidity in the global market for mortgage-backed securities. In other words, nobody wants to buy the debt boxes anymore. They're essentially worthless. Other European banks follow with similar announcements. The real picture was becoming clear. The mortgage-backed securities that were supposed to be AAA and safe are in reality worthless. And even worse, they had spread through the global financial system undetected like a cancer. As a result of these shock announcements, there was a panic among financial firms and banks. Investors looked around and wanted to pull any funding that was thought to be vulnerable to mortgage losses. Financial institutions struggled to assess the values of their books. What they thought was worth trillions of dollars could actually be worth close to zero. The contagion continued to spread. September 2007. UK bank Northern Rock was also playing with high leverage and financially engineered products, and they have to be bailed out by the Bank of England. Investors then queued to take their money out. It was the first bank run in the UK since 1866. While all of this was going on, the Federal Reserve was still clueless. They forecasted that the slowdown would be mild, stating that there would still be 3% GDP growth. Come on, guys. March of 2008 sees Bear Stearns fall. Bear Stearns was a pillar of Wall Street dating back to 1923 and was the fifth largest investment bank. The firm carried a notional market value of $13.4 trillion. So how did this number get so high? This was because they were also being reckless and using very high leverage, which multiplied their losses. Bear Stearns bet big on the mortgage markets and lost.
The markets have certainly gotten worse, but our liquidity position has not changed at all. Our balance sheet has not weakened at all.
And yet 48 hours later, everything changes. This morning, Schwartz said that the firm's cash position had deteriorated sharply over the past day. Questions now being asked at this hour. Loss of $3.5 billion in market value today alone.
They were bought by JP Morgan for $2 a share. Just earlier in the year, Bear Stearns was worth $170 per share. Global panic ensued, and it was at a fever pitch. Lehman Brothers, the fourth largest investment bank, is being looked at as the next to fall. It was also heavily exposed to the subprime mortgage financial products. Lehman CFO, Erin Callan, calmed investors by boasting of a profit of $489 million. The stock jumps 48% on the news. But all wasn't as it seems. A later 2010 report by the court examiner stated that Lehman executives regularly used accounting gimmicks at the end of each quarter to make their financials seem less shaky than they really were. In reality, their risky commercial real estate holdings were 30 times greater than their capital. Lehman Brothers were so highly leveraged that a 3 to 5% decline in real estate values would completely wipe out all of their capital. By June, Lehman Brothers reported a $2.6 billion loss, which no amount of accounting magic could hide. Their stock falls by 73%. Meanwhile, other banks such as Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs started betting against the mortgage securities, which they were still selling, and they would make hundreds of millions of dollars, while investors lost everything. Unbelievable. At this time, the US had now tipped into recession as GDP fell by 2.1%. September 2008, the crisis begins to spin out of control, and Lehman Brothers collapses. This marks the largest US bankruptcy of all time.
The U.S. government said it won't bail out Lehman, which last week announced more than $3.9 billion in losses. Shares in Lehman Brothers have plummeted more than 80% in 2008 alone.
Everybody in the West, at least, owns, a lot of people have got pensions, and these pensions invest in stock market, and a lot of the shares are actually the shares of banks. And when bank shares get hammered, people's pensions get hammered, so everybody loses.
Lehman Brothers is going bankrupt after talks to pull them back from the abyss collapsed. And financial markets from Asia to Europe are doing their utmost to prevent Monday from turning from dark to black.
This is going to be one of the watershed days in financial markets history.
It was a manic Monday in the financial markets. The Dow tumbled more than 500 points after two pillars of the street tumbled over the weekend. Lehman Brothers, a 158-year-old firm, filed for bankruptcy.
I don't think anyone really expected a bank as big as Lehman to be in a position that it's in now.
Brought down by bad mortgage investments, Lehman, which has 25,000 employees, will be liquidated.
I'm starting to find another job.
Meanwhile, Merrill Lynch, fearing it could be next, agreed in an act of desperation to a shotgun marriage with Bank of America. So in just 6 months, 3 of the 5 biggest independent firms on Wall Street have now disappeared. Bear Stearns, which collapsed last spring, Lehman Brothers, and Merrill Lynch. Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson tried to reassure.
The banks were all scared, and they stopped lending to each other, and the financial system froze. Companies couldn't order parts, pay for staff, and businesses ground to a halt. And if nothing was done, planes would have to stop flying.
We came as close as we have ever come in history to a total cardiac arrest, not just of the American economy, but the entire world economy.
Meaning everybody's afraid to lend to everybody else. Credit simply freezes, and an economy, a modern economy, can't function that way?
A modern economy can't function without credit for more than even a couple of hours, frankly, seconds. GE, the pillar of American manufacturing, was having a hard time getting short-term credit. So was Harvard University. Wage bills were not being paid.
Knowing that something had to be done, the infamous bailout started. On September 16, 2008, the US Federal Reserve stepped in to buy AIG, the largest insurer in the US. While Lehman was just another bank, AIG presented a systemic risk to the entire financial system, or so they told us. It was an $85 billion loan, and this was the origin of the famous too big to fail argument.
We're in an urgent situation, and the consequences will grow worse each day if we do not act.
The US government gave the banks $700 billion to purchase toxic assets and bank shares to stop them from falling any lower. It did work, but the biggest banks just ended up being even larger after buying up all the other failing banks. The use of hundreds of billions of dollars of taxpayers' money to bail out these banks sparked complete outrage. It was the beginning of mass distrust in institutions and governments. The immediate result was the Occupy Wall Street movement and the invention of Bitcoin. Bailing out the banks was an unpopular move. But the other option wasn't fun either. The crash of 1929 and the subsequent Great Depression lasted for almost a decade. There's arguments to be made on both sides. As for now, the crisis was still in full swing. The Federal Reserve also cut interest rates in the hope of restoring the market. In total, during the fourth quarter of 2008, the Central Bank of the United States purchased $2.5 trillion of government debt and junk private assets from the banks. Up until that point, this was the largest monetary policy action in the history of the world. By 2009, the stock market has fallen 50% from its 2007 highs. Pension funds were completely wiped out. As we know, it wasn't just the US that suffered. Institutions and governments around the world owned American assets. In 2008, it became obvious that the crisis was going to have global repercussions. After the fall of Lehman Brothers, banks and corporations globally began to fail. In the UK, HBOS was taken over by Lloyds, and the UK government steps in to save its banking system. With lending markets drying up around the world, the central banks of the United States, European Union, Australia, Canada, and Japan coordinated injecting cash into debt markets for the first time since 9/11. November of 2008 sees the International Monetary Fund approve loans to stabilize Ukraine and Iceland. By December 2008, riots had broken out in Greece.
Much of the day, the clashes were centred around the Greek parliament, one of the few buildings here being adequately protected.
Iceland was hit particularly bad. Relative to the size of its economy, the systemic collapse was the largest experienced by any country in economic history. Some of the biggest banks in the nation became worthless, and their stock market fell by almost 80%.
Here as elsewhere, the police are first to meet the anger and despair amongst the population. During the past weekends, thousands have taken to the streets to protest against their government and alleged corruption amongst bank managers. For the first time in history in this tiny nation, leading politicians and businessmen are now protected by armed guards. Landsbanki was one of 3 big Icelandic banks that had engaged in an uncontrolled loaning spree abroad. When the international credit crunch hit, they had accumulated loans worth 12 times the nation's GDP. When the banks defaulted, the state had to take over their debts, worth more than $60 billion.
Unlike many countries, the people of Iceland actually chased out their bankers and jailed them. Meanwhile, in the United States, the top 5 Lehman executives walked away with $2 billion, and they got to keep the money. The rest of Europe was still hit hard, the results of which was the European debt crisis, a multi-year economic crisis that took place from 2009 until the end of the 2010s. Some member states, namely Portugal, Greece, Spain, and Ireland, were unable to repay or refinance their government debt. Until today, countries like Greece are still struggling to overcome their financial issues. On April 10, 2009, Time magazine declared, quote, "More quickly than it began, the banking crisis is over." But was it really? Problems still persisted. Wages and incomes continued to languish. The real economy was limping. People would be out of work for a few years to come, and by 2010, unemployment around the world had risen, hitting almost 10% in the United States and Europe. 6 million Americans lost their jobs, and 8 million lost their home.
Oscar Munoz used to sell real estate. Now his company clears out foreclosed homes.
I wonder, do you ever come to houses where the people are still here?
Absolutely. That's really a sad situation. I'd rather not meet the people.
Why not?
It's not easy to come in and move a family out. It's just our job to do it for the bank. It's just the nature of what's going on in the market right now.
In 2010, regulatory action was finally taken. The US government passed the Dodd-Frank Act. It included more oversight and transparency for financially engineered products, limits on risky bank investments, tighter regulation for rating agencies. The whole aim was to stop this kind of disaster from ever happening again. But unfortunately, it doesn't seem to have worked. Today, banks have reinvented the debt boxes and the tools used to speculate on them. This time, they're calling them bespoke collateralized synthetic obligations. This time, they're using corporate debt instead of mortgages. 2022 saw a large spike in activity, quadrupling to $40 billion in this year alone. Let's just hope that corporations don't all default on their debt due to a systemic shock. I personally don't think we'll have another crisis exactly the same as 2008, but safe to say, these stupid financial experiments aren't helping. I really sincerely hope that there's not more of them out there which we just don't know about. So what happened next? What scars did such a disaster leave on the economy? Well, there's some strong arguments to be made that there has been no real economy since 2008. If you look at the GDP per capita of the real economy of the United States, it never recovered. It has been below trend since 2008. If you're in your late 30s onwards, this is probably why it felt harder for the average person to get ahead since the crash. In the United States alone, it's projected that an adult that lived through the crash has lost about $70,000 in lifetime earnings. Younger people were less affected, but less employment opportunities still set them back. For the first time, a whole generation would be poorer than their parents. It's not uncommon for younger people to live paycheck to paycheck, funding their lives with buy now, pay later debt. Subsequently, the fertility rates around the world have decreased significantly after 2008. There may be other explanations for the phenomenon, but the charts are clear. A financial disaster would certainly impact the way families would plan for their future. After the 2008 crisis, central banks gained more power. They set interest rates low for so long that the stock market and eventually the whole financial system adjusted and settled around this state. Low interest rates meant cheap money. People, companies, and governments borrowed money with virtually no interest. Investments turned risky, and excessive debt distorted many markets. By the mid-2010s, these conditions had become the scaffolding for the whole financial system. Growth became dependent on central banks keeping these conditions the same. Wealth inequality exploded as those closest to the financial industry got extremely rich, while the rest of the general populace stayed the same. By the late 2010s, many economic commentators were referring to this as the everything bubble. First it was stocks, then it was housing, then it's the debt market now, which controls everything. This next point is key to really understanding the death of the real economy. Economic productivity. This is the measure of how much stuff you get out from the resources that you put in. Since 2008, it's been severely injured. Due to zero interest rates for so long after 2008, the investment that would have gone to productive areas of the economy catapulted into riskier sectors. The real economy just didn't get the capital it needed to innovate and develop and do things more efficiently. Low economic productivity affects real wage growth, living standards, and quality of life. Even former Federal Reserve Chair Janet Yellen called it the, quote, most important factor determining continued advancements in living standards. This is why, when our leaders told us that the economy was booming in the 2010s, it really didn't feel like that to many people. Productivity was gone. It's a missing piece of the 21st century economic story that's often left out. Then we come to 2020, and the pandemic saw central banks respond much quicker with a lot of force, printing trillions of dollars as the economy was slowing to a halt. There's no denying that this mitigated the pain. But was this an overreaction? Many think so. Economic professor Jeremy Siegel called it a monumental mistake. Regardless, the stock market loved it and vaulted to all-time highs. Then, investments into risky assets like NFTs shot up. Eventually, there was too much money in the system and not enough goods, and the prices of everything started to rise. Aside from the fallout of COVID and the war in Ukraine, a component of inflation today comes from the actions of central banks. In the latest stage of this roller coaster, central banks have panicked at the large inflation and have started raising rates. This was to slow down the economy and reduce demand, and this is supposed to bring down inflation. But as stated, low rates and easy money had become the scaffolding of the financial system. Raising interest rates reverses these conditions that the financial system was used to. This is why, as soon as interest rates start rising, everything seems to be falling apart. Stock markets are crashing, and companies are laying off staff. The whole system just isn't used to a normal interest rate environment. Today, there's a lot more debt in the system than in 2008, and this was thanks to central banks keeping interest rates near zero for more than a decade. Increasing rates would make this large volume of debt harder to manage for individuals and governments. Countries like Australia, Canada, and the UK have a lot of variable rate mortgages, which will snap higher to market rates over the next few years. Subprime car loans and credit card loans are seeing increased defaults. Meanwhile, Credit Suisse is in trouble and they're selling part of their domestic bank. Central bank liquidity swaps are going crazy in Switzerland, doubling in the past couple of weeks. It looks like we're going to have another recession, but what happens beyond that is anyone's guess. After almost 15 years, the 2008 recession has taught us several lessons. It was the loose lending standards and low central bank interest rates that started the problem. Financial engineering spread it to the world. Bad policy, accounting fraud, and poor credit rating agencies fanned the flames. Although structural reform has taken place since 2008, we should also take a deeper look into central banks and their decisions. They always seem to print and leave rates too low for too long, distorting markets and blowing up bubbles, only to pop these bubbles later. It's a scenario that seems to be playing out again today. All in all, the real lesson that we as a society never seem to learn is to keep those in charge accountable and also to plan for the unpredictable. So, for you personally, what can you do if you're worried and don't trust our expert leaders? The key is to avoid risk. If you're inclined to keep your money safe, think about assets that have little to no risk or financial engineering behind them. Some believe physical gold and silver, as boring as they may seem, are the ultimate riskless assets. Others believe government bonds are. Others still think plain old cash is best. Talk to a financial professional to make that personal decision and to sleep easier at night. So before I finally go, I do want to hear some stories from 2008 from you guys. I know I was too young to be impacted directly, but I did know and I got a sense that the world was changing while I was studying in university. So what do you remember from this period? Anyway, a massive thanks for watching. This episode did take a lot of effort to bring to life, so I do want to thank you for sticking till the end. If you did like it, take a look around the channel. There's a lot of interesting stuff on science, technology, business, and finance. In the next episode, we'll move away from finance for a second and take a look at an interesting story. Did you know that apart from Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, Apple had a third co-founder, and he sold 10% of his Apple shares for a measly $800 in 1976? Well, I'll see you next time in that episode. My name is Dagogo, and you've been watching Cold Fusion. Cheers, guys. Have a good one.
Cold Fusion. It's new thinking.
This episode is brought to you by Brilliant. Hi, welcome to another episode of Cold Fusion. How did a 1979 panel with David Attenborough result in this? It's a strange question, but hear me out. In the late 1970s, David Attenborough was having trouble entering China to film his documentaries. He decided to join a committee panel in China in order to change this. Attenborough just happened to ask a Chinese high-up official, Deng Xiaoping, what China was going to do about their rapidly growing population. In answering David's question, it was here, on this panel, that China's one-child policy would be revealed to the world. this policy decision would cascade into a myriad of problems, both demographic and economic. I've covered China's broader economic woes in the previous video, so check the link below if you haven't caught it yet. But as for our story, in China, there was now too few young people.
The world's most populous country has hit an historic turning point. Today, China announced its first population decline in 6 decades.
Government data shows the birth rate at a record low, with the fewest babies born last year since the founding of Communist China in 1949.
But things would only get worse in July of 2022, when a data leak showed that Chinese authorities have overcounted the population by over 100 million young people. China now has too many residential buildings and not enough buyers. With the real estate market about 30% of China's GDP and 70% of Chinese wealth tied up in the sector, I don't have to tell you that this is a big deal. At the center of the crisis is Evergrande, which was once one of China's largest property developers by sales. It had 1,300 real estate projects in over 280 cities in China, housing 12 million people. Yet the company is over $320 billion in debt, making it the world's most indebted real estate company. With the company filing for bankruptcy and some high-up officials being arrested, analysts fear that this could be China's Lehman Brothers moment. Since the Chinese economy is the second largest on the planet, it's not hard to see why a total real estate collapse would send shockwaves throughout the world. Now that we have all of this context, how bad will it get? To find out, let's take a deeper look into Evergrande itself.
You are watching Cold Fusion TV.
Before we continue, I just want to introduce today's sponsor, Brilliant. A lot of the topics I cover on this channel may seem complicated to some, but now there's an easy and fun way to learn more about them. Brilliant's interactive courses on anything from computer science to physics make learning fun and easy. As I've mentioned before, I really like their Artificial Neural Networks course. I think that first principles understanding is important. It was a great way to brush up on the fundamentals of modern AI systems. If you want to brush up on your learning, either for leisure or in your professional career, you can get started for free for 30 days, and the first 200 people to sign up get 20% off an annual plan. Visit the URL brilliant.org/coldfusion to get started. Okay, so let's continue. Evergrande was more than a property developer. You might be surprised to know that they dipped their toes into far-reaching fields as far as EVs and theme parks. For example, Evergrande New Energy had ambitious goals to compete with Tesla in China and dominate the EV industry by 2025. They were planning 14 different car models and 5 million cars per year. Evergrande Spring produces bottled water and claimed to be China's largest water source. Evergrande also owned not one, but 4 soccer teams, and they participated in China's professional league. Evergrande operated 15 theme parks under the name Fairyland, which aimed to beat Disneyland in both size and service. However, beneath the surface, these lofty adventures were funded by a pile of growing debt, but more on that later. Evergrande began as a small company in Guangzhou in 1996. They grew into a giant due to a lucky break that happened in the 1990s. Economic progress in China had lifted millions from poverty and into the middle class. And what do middle class people want? Houses, and lots of them. In 1998, China allowed households to buy and sell apartments. With countless millions gaining prosperity over the following years, there was a huge surge in housing demand. The government incentivized home ownership. They relaxed mortgage rules, gave tax benefits, and allowed easy bank lending. Meanwhile, Evergrande's founder, Hui Kaiyan, saw his chance. To get started, he strategically acquired land at favorable prices from local governments, often providing upfront payments and ambitious sales targets for his employees. This approach led to the company's successful IPO in Hong Kong in 2009, and it transformed its founder into a billionaire. From 2010 to 2020, Evergrande's revenue increased year on year, At its peak, Evergrande had a market value of $47 billion and assets worth $353 billion. Its portfolio expanded from residential to include commercial real estate, hotels, resorts, schools, hospitals, sports stadiums, and cultural centres. But all would not remain well for the property giant. A series of events would threaten Evergrande and the stability of the Chinese economy as a whole. Evergrande's growth strategy was straightforward. First, they would borrow money for land acquisition, and then sell these homes to buyers before the homes were even built. They would then use the proceeds to repay lenders and fund the next project. This approach, while lucrative, bore the resemblance of a classic Ponzi scheme, the consequences of which would come back to haunt Evergrande. It was an aggressive, unsustainable expansion strategy. In order to work, it relied heavily on perpetual borrowing, and it worked well for 2 decades, but came at a steep cost, and that cost was a huge amount of debt. But Evergrande's massive debt wasn't its only problem. Betting on property, a national pastime in China, was causing further economic problems to brew beneath the surface. Property ownership is very important in Chinese culture. Some men even deem it necessary to find a life partner. During China's one-child policy, parents sadly preferred to keep only male children. As a result, today, men outnumber women for those in their mid-40s and below. And usually, if a man couldn't afford his own property, their parents would help chip in. Over the past few decades, property demand has been driven, in a small part, due to romantic reasons. As demand for property caused the market to overheat, even more fuel was added to the fire, and this included a lack of other stable investment options in China. Investing in real estate is preferred to stocks or bonds, as it's seen as safer and more profitable. 2. Easy access to credit through online platforms and relaxed lending standards. This helped China's household debt to GDP ratio surge from 18% in 2009 to a staggering 63.3% by March 2023, a 3-fold increase in just 15 years. Number 3, an increasing trend in property speculation. Many investors bought properties in developing areas, intending to sell them later at a higher price. Before long, tiny apartments in Shanghai were fetching Sydney, London, or New York type prices, despite the wages in Chinese cities being much lower. Currently, about 70% of household wealth is invested in real estate. So, thinking that there was more demand than there actually was, Evergrande overbuilt in some areas. But why would they think that there was more people left to buy houses than there actually were? It could be because of this next point. The one-child policy was enacted on faulty data. The literal rocket scientist who calculated the projected population of China, Song Jian, forgot to factor in declining birth rates due to women getting educated and contraceptive proliferation. His predictions ended up being completely wrong, the consequences of which would be very serious. Last year, births in China dropped sharply to 9.56 million. That sounds like a lot, but it's the fewest since 1790. And things just get worse. A 2022 data leak from the records of Shanghai police showed the details of 1 billion Chinese people. The leak is believed to be authentic, and it paints a staggering picture. The population has been overcounted by over 100 million people. To give you an idea of the scale of the problem, the Chinese government 2020 census showed that there were 18.4 million people who were born in 2017, 30% more that were born in 2002. But the 2022 leaked data says that there weren't 30% more people born in this year, but 70% fewer born than in 2002. This isn't just a miscalculation, but a complete demographic disaster in the making. Soon, there's just not going to be enough young people to support the aging generation. Demographer Yi Fuxian has looked closely into China for over a decade. His findings line up squarely with the data leaks, giving them more credibility. In short, Chinese property developers built for a projected population boom, which never happened. And to add to this, youth unemployment has hit 21.3%, making buying a property increasingly hard for the younger generation.
6岁到28岁左右，这些人他们很难找到工作的， 你现在有影响吗？你感觉了吗？
对对对，这个体感是蛮强烈的。这个就是确实是现在就失业率是比较高。
是。
然后呢，因为确实就中国的这个本科毕业生特别多嘛，就大家都觉得自己是大学生，然后有很多工作觉得放不下身段去做。因为我们年轻人确实不像老一辈嘛，他会觉得说自己需要很多的储蓄或者怎么样。年轻人可能观念会更开放一点，觉得自己我可能不会想特别多很往后的事情。
The culmination of all of these factors have created vivid imagery of the problem. Eerily empty concrete husks that dot the skyline in certain regions. While sometimes these developments eventually see habitation, today, more often than not, they sit empty. No sounds of cars or people, just empty concrete towers, and in some cases, they're completely demolished in one of the most spectacular examples of wasted resources. As both demand for housing and China's population growth have slowed down in recent years, developers like Evergrande are facing even more pressure to sell their properties to repay their debts. But collecting revenue from property sales has been proving harder than first thought. While the housing market was red hot, Xi Jinping was watching with a keen eye. The property sector was getting out of control and action needed to be taken fast. In 2020, Xi Jinping ordered the authorities to implement strict and stringent regulations that would shake Evergrande and China as a whole. These would be known as the famous 3 red lines, a strict debt reduction and financial compliance policy that had one main goal: to reduce the economy's heavy reliance on the property sector, which was now approaching 30% of GDP. Evergrande, as well as many other developers, failed to meet these requirements. They continued to accumulate debt. Evergrande spent huge sums of money on costly land acquisitions and overbuilding during the property market frenzy. Ventures into unrelated sectors such as electric cars and theme parks had little to no profitability. Moreover, the company lacked transparency and engaged in deceptive financial practices, concealing its true debt and cash flow from regulators and investors. All these factors created the perfect storm for Evergrande. By 2021, Evergrande owed over $300 billion. And this was owed to banks, bondholders, suppliers, and investors. To put that into perspective, that is more money than the GDP of Finland or Pakistan. In total, Chinese developers had debts exceeding $5 trillion. Stop and think about that for a second. Throw in the Chinese government's zero-COVID policies, the strictest lockdown in the world, and there was a great level of uncertainty and risk around the property sector. The stage was set. Evergrande announced a trading halt in October 2021. However, it didn't give details on why. The trading suspension lasted for 17 months, and during that period, Evergrande's woes deepened. A liquidity crisis, numerous defaults on bond payments, plunging share prices, and junk ratings from credit agencies. In 2021 alone, the company lost $81 billion. Customers were also disgruntled with their unfinished properties. Investors demanded refunds or compensation. This series of setbacks over the last few years have eroded Evergrande's market value by 99%. From a record high of $42 billion to the company now worth $1 billion today. On August 17, 2023, Evergrande made a final attempt to save itself from collapse by seeking Chapter 15 bankruptcy protection in a New York court. This form of bankruptcy protects the US assets of foreign companies from creditors during debt restructuring in their home country. In doing this, Evergrande hoped to avoid potential legal actions by US bondholders while it facilitated its restructuring process in China. This kind of bankruptcy protection doesn't guarantee a successful debt restructuring or even default avoidance because it still requires approval from Chinese courts and regulators. Another massive Chinese real estate developer, Country Garden, would overtake Evergrande, but they would also instantly trip over. Country Garden lost $7.1 billion in the first 6 months of 2023. Investors concerned about potential debt defaults have sent its stock plummeting. Meanwhile, Evergrande's shares resumed trading on August 27, 2023, 17 months after that trading halt. And it was a disaster.
Increasingly more information about what's happening with restructurings. Of course, the poster child of this is Evergrande. Reported results in the weekend. It's resuming trade today. this one's going through the floor, isn't it?
Yes, it'll, just like many of the other developers that have resumed after a year plus of activity, Evergrande investors have 17 months of news to react to. So since then, we've had $85 billion of losses that Evergrande has reported over the last 2.5 years.
Instantly, there was a massive sell-off, and the stock plunged 87% in just one day. This wiped out $2.2 billion in market value. On September 18th, 2023, some arrests were made at Evergrande Financial Wealth Management. It's not clear what the arrests were for, but police have only stated that they were, quote, suspected criminals. The stock fell another 25% on the news. And with that swift decline, it's looking like the once powerful giant has fallen. Evergrande's collapse is unprecedented in Chinese history. It's affected various sectors and people, from iron ore miners to steel and cement producers, home retail businesses, construction workers, and more. As the net worth of Chinese citizens reduces with property prices, spending in local and international markets will decrease. As mentioned in the previous video, if the Australian government doesn't diversify its trading exports, there could be a ripple effect here. The US, Hong Kong, Japan, South Korea, many Western nations in Europe, and the global economy will be affected if current trajectory continues. And remember the middle-class investors that we spoke about earlier in the video? Many of these home buyers now have paid deposits on unfinished properties. It's another issue in this calamity. Evergrande has pre-sold more than 1.4 million homes that have not yet been delivered. Many buyers are families who invested their life savings, and now they risk losing their money on these homes. We may talk a lot about numbers and policy decisions, but this is the true human cost. Overall, new construction is down 24.5% just this year alone. Prices in some areas have fallen by as much as 25% from their October 2021 peaks. The banks and other financial institutions that lent money to Evergrande could face problems of their own. For Evergrande, there's about $20 billion owed to foreign investors. This isn't to mention the Belt and Road Initiative by China, carried out in over 149 different countries. Evergrande was one of the biggest buyers of construction materials. So it's clear to see that with Evergrande's bankruptcy spilling into global markets, the knock-on effects could change the livelihood and well-being of millions of people, not just in China, but overseas. As quoted by Fortune magazine on August 17, 2023, Chinese real estate may be the world economy's most important single sector. So, is this China's Lehman Brothers moment? Well, the answer is not so simple. Yes, both cases involved a highly leveraged and opaque sector, sectors that were critical to the economy and financial system, and both had an element of global risk. However, it's important to note the distinctions. China has an advantage in a state-controlled banking system, though whether you call that an advantage or not depends on your view. Regardless, the Chinese government has already supported the banking sector with liquidity and relaxed some regulations to ease the pressure on the property market. But there's no indication that they're going to bail out Evergrande or any of the other developers that are in trouble. Authorities might even use accounting methods to avoid major bank failures. This opinion was shared by George Mangus, a research associate at Oxford University's China Centre. He states, quote, "In a state banking system, the authorities can move liabilities around the financial system and use extend and pretend accounting to ensure that major banks don't fail and that smaller ones can be made good or managed as necessary. China also has a huge foreign exchange reserve and tight capital flow control. Unlike the United States, which is the world's biggest debtor nation, China is actually the world's biggest creditor nation. But all of this doesn't mean that there's going to be no damage. There are legitimate concerns about the global impacts given the size and influence of China's real estate economy. Right now, it's about damage control, but it's going to take time, maybe even years, to revive the industry. Once consumer sentiment changes so drastically in a housing market, that's hard to bring back. So in conclusion, Evergrande's collapse marks a significant challenge for China. As we look ahead, the stakes are exceptionally high for major industry players in the country. At the same time, it's a tense moment for those whose financial futures are in jeopardy. At this stage, The only things that would stop this from getting worse is government intervention or a stabilization of house prices. On a final note, China does have many state-owned property entities, so it's very possible that they could just take over and stem the bleeding. It's a totally different kind of economy, and with murky data, it's difficult for anyone to provide a concrete analysis. But in saying all of this, as is always the case, this unfolding financial disaster comes down to reckless financial decisions damaging lives. But this time, there's some dodgy government population estimates to go along with it. So what are your thoughts on this matter? Let me know in the comment section below. I'm sure it's going to be a very interesting discussion. Anyway, that's about it from me. My name is Dagogo, and you've been watching Cold Fusion. If you want to see anything else on science, technology, or business, feel free to subscribe. It's free. Alright, cheers guys. Have a good one.
Cold fusion. It's new thinking.
This video is brought to you by Discord. Hi, welcome to another episode of Cold Fusion. In 2009, a man by the name of James Howells proved himself to be a visionary. He started mining Bitcoin before anyone else had ever heard of it. James managed to stockpile 7,500 Bitcoins when they were just a fraction of a cent per coin. Eventually his girlfriend made him stop. She thought that the computer doing the mining was, quote, getting too noisy. James later ended up throwing the hard drive in the trash, and today, this mistake cost him over $400 million.
To get your money, you would need that hard drive?
Yeah, there's a specific file on that hard drive called a wallet file, which the Bitcoin is stored in. And without that file, there is no way of getting the money back because there is no central server that records a log of it.
In 2010, Laszlo Hanyecz bought 2 pizzas for 10,000 Bitcoin, or about $35 at the time. It wasn't the first transaction in Bitcoin, but certainly the most widely publicized. Unfortunately today, these delicious pizzas cost him $500 million.
Is it true some people celebrate the anniversary of the day you bought the pizza?
Yeah, May 22nd, Bitcoin Pizza Day, so
it's called Bitcoin Pizza Day?
It is.
It's stories like this that make Bitcoin such a fascinating phenomenon. Its growth and adoption, at least over recent years, has been mind-blowing. But the story of how Bitcoin came to be is just as interesting. Despite Bitcoin's young age when compared to traditional stores of value, the fundamental ideas behind crypto may be older than you think. So the question has to be asked, where did Bitcoin actually come from? Who is the mysterious individual who invented it? Sit back, relax. In this 2-part series, we'll find out.
You are watching Cold Fusion TV.
For many, Bitcoin is still considered a fad, a Ponzi scheme, something that will disappear as quickly as it materialized. The cryptocurrency has had its fair share of bad reputation through fake crypto frauds such as BitConnect and OneCoin, not to mention payment for narcotics on Silk Road.
What's happening is there's all these copycat cryptocurrencies that are going out there, and there's no regulation on the actual level of Bitcoin itself. You're talking, yeah, there's futures regulation, but the underlying asset is completely unregulated. It's a dark market.
Bitcoin is worthless artificial gold, which if it succeeded would facilitate a lot of illicit activity.
But the word is starting to get through that Bitcoin is much more than that. People are starting to look at our economic system with increasing skepticism. Currency is continuously being created. Food prices and bond yields are rising, hinting at inflation. And knowing that the long-term value of all fiat currencies over the last few thousand years has tended towards zero, it's only natural to think that there may be some issues ahead. I've outlined financial problems specifically in my How Money is Created video, which all of you really enjoyed, but it clearly highlights that there's a need for new thinking on the topic. Friedrich Hayek, winner of the 1974 Nobel Prize in Economics, stated the following in 1984. I don't believe we shall ever have a good money again before we take the thing out of the hands of government. All we can do is by some sly roundabout way introduce something that they can't stop. End quote. While it's undeniable that Bitcoin is not perfect, it broadly achieves this goal, and as you'll soon see, it can't be stopped. So before we continue, it's probably wise to have a quick primer on Bitcoin. I first talked about Bitcoin on this channel back in 2013, and since then we've done a whole bunch of episodes on Bitcoin and blockchain. But for those that are new, here's a quick summary. When you pay a shop using a bank card, the shop checks with the bank to see if you have money to make the purchase. The bank checks its records, verifies that you have enough money, and deducts that amount from your card. It then updates its records and takes a fee for providing their services. If you wanted to remove the banks from the system, who would you trust to keep the records straight? No altering or cheating. No one would ever trust a single person with that much power, but you may give your trust to a collective group of people, many millions in fact. The main idea is to not have a centralized record of transactions. Many copies of those transactions are distributed across the world. Every owner of each copy records every transaction. In this new model, the shop, instead of checking with the banks, checks with everyone's records to see if you have the money. When the purchase is made, all the record keepers update their records. If an individual transaction record is fraudulent, it doesn't agree with the rest of the copies of the transaction records and gets rejected. This large group of people checking record transactions aren't people at all, but a network of computers. There is no need for third parties such as banks, because the decentralized network keeps itself in check. Amazingly, that means no bans, no server shutdowns, or blocking of payments, because payments occur directly between people. Although transactions can be tracked, they cannot be stopped. So-called miners keep the network running by solving complex equations on their computers. These people mine Bitcoin in chunks called blocks that contain all of the recent transactions. Blocks are kind of like a page in a record-keeping book. The miners receive payment in Bitcoin for their effort, much like mining gold. Also like gold, there's a finite supply of Bitcoin to stop it from being devalued, much like we're currently seeing in fiat currency. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoins, and the final Bitcoin will be mined in 2140. So what gives Bitcoin its value? In reality, it's just worth what someone's willing to pay for it. So could the price drop to zero? If confidence is lost, yes, it's possible. But regardless, it is a pretty interesting idea. There's an argument to be made that the value of Bitcoin is actually the trust and utility of the Bitcoin network itself. What the price is for that value, no one is sure yet.
So yeah, I think a really useful idea. A blockchain is just a type of database. It's a distributed ledger that in some use cases, like for a banking back office, is kind of like a database upgrade. So massive improvements in efficiency, but probably not that transformative or disruptive. When you take a blockchain and you make it public and decentralized, and then you add money to that, you add a cryptocurrency, then you're looking at something that is that first use case, that offshore banking system, that I think is fundamentally disruptive, and disruptive financially, economically, and even potentially politically.
So how is Bitcoin maintained? Bitcoin is open source, so anyone can edit the code. It's a misconception that the code has stayed the same for the past 10 years. There's maintenance carried out to ensure smooth functioning. This is done through a Bitcoin Improvement Proposal, or BIP. A BIP is just a document that proposes core changes. But to stop someone from inserting some code that says, say, give every Cold Fusion viewer 1,000 Bitcoin, there needs to be 95% consensus across the last 2,000 miners. Basically, it's a digital voting system. On January 3rd, 2009, the first block of Bitcoin was mined. Within this very first block, a special message was written. It read, quote, "The Times, 3rd of January 2009, Chancellor on the brink of second bailout for banks." This gives us a clue to Bitcoin's purpose for existing, a response to a broken financial system. Just 9 days after the first block was mined, the first Bitcoin transaction is completed. It was between Bitcoin's creator, Satoshi Nakamoto, and another cryptographic enthusiast, Hal Finney. It was a healthy sum of 10 Bitcoin, worthless at the time as there were no exchanges to determine a price. Satoshi Nakamoto would announce his invention of a new economic system on a cryptography mailing list on July 9th, 2009. Hal Finney would help Satoshi fix bugs and improve security in those early days. While these steps mark Bitcoin's creation and the first instance of application, this is by no means the beginning of Bitcoin's story. For that, we must travel back over 2 decades to the year 1983. In 1983, American cryptographer David Chaum is already experimenting with the idea of electronic cash. He was part of a movement known as the cypherpunks. They were activists who defended the idea of using cryptography and computers as a powerful tool to protect the privacy of individuals. If you were to put it into political terms, they were kind of like digital libertarians. David wanted to create a safer and more anonymous transaction system. His efforts led to the invention of the blind signature protocol, breaking ground on what would become known as the foundations for modern blockchain technology.
I created a concept for how you could use eCash to make your payments, and then the blind signatures could be used to basically prove things about you without revealing who you are. Classic, say, if a kid's at a bar and they want to, or somewhere they want to get in, they have to prove that they're old enough, or they have a driving license, or they're from a different state or whatever, but they don't want to give their address and all this other stuff. Well, that's what you could do with the credential mechanism.